Section 1. The show that hides things in plain sight. There is a town somewhere in Rhode Island that does not exist on any map. You cannot drive to it. You cannot find it listed in any directory of real places. It sits somewhere near the coast, where the salt air comes off the Atlantic in the late afternoon, and the seagulls wheel overhead with the particular confidence of seagulls in New England, which is to say absolute and unapologetic confidence in their right to occupy whatever space they choose. The streets are wide and lined with houses that have seen better days and do not especially care that you know it. The bars are dimly lit and smell of decades of accumulated evenings, and the specific kind of quiet that settles over a place where people have been sitting together long enough that conversation has become optional. The people inside them have been sitting in the same seats for over 25 years without aging a single day, which tells you something about either the preservative qualities of whatever they are drinking or the specific and strange nature of time in this particular location. The roads are familiar if you have spent any real time watching primetime television on Sunday nights over the past quarter century. Spooner Street is a broad, quiet residential stretch, the kind of street that would be entirely unremarkable anywhere in New England except for what happens on it. The Drunken Clam Bar is tucked into a corner where it has always been, which is to say it has been there since January of 1999 and will presumably continue to be there until the broadcast network that airs the show containing it makes a different business decision. The high school named after an actor named James Woods continues to produce teenagers who are exactly as confused and unloved as teenagers everywhere in the developed world. The brewery outside of town churns along producing ale that the show has placed at the center of several storylines. The local news comes on at 5. The city governance of Quahog, Rhode Island has been shaped for many years by an eccentric mayor whose eccentricity the show treated as comedy until it ran that particular thread into the ground and kept going anyway, because that is what Family Guy does with threads when it has run them into the ground. And at the end of Spooner Street, in a house with a green lawn and a white exterior, and a door that has been opened and closed roughly 10,000 times across the show's broadcast history, a family lives in a state of deliberate and structural chaos that never resolves, never advances in any meaningful narrative sense, and never quite burns itself down even when it appears to have gone past all possible recovery. The father does things that should land him in prison, not occasionally, as a quirk of his otherwise functional personality that the show keeps in check regularly, with a consistency that would, in any functioning society with a functioning legal apparatus, generate an accumulating institutional response of the kind that eventually results in someone being removed from their home and placed somewhere they cannot continue to harm the people and property around them. The mother holds the household together with a grip that is sometimes desperately tight and sometimes mysteriously absent, depending entirely on what the episode needs her to be in any given 22 minutes. The oldest daughter absorbs punishment from every direction, with a patience that the show has never fully interrogated and never been entirely comfortable leaving completely alone. The son drifts through his scenes with a sweet, foggy geniality that occasionally reveals itself to be something more interesting before being allowed to drift back into fog. The baby has technology that no government on Earth possesses and a plan for using it that he has been intermittently and incoherently pursuing for over 2 decades without anyone in the household treating this as the significant and alarming fact that it actually is. The dog drinks martinis and broods about his novel, and dates women who are inexplicably willing to date a dog, and holds opinions about American political discourse that he shares with a frequency and a self-assurance that his companions appear to find exhausting but have given up. Challenging. None of it is explained. Not properly. Not in the way that a show genuinely invested in the internal logic of its own universe would bother explaining the foundational premises of that universe. Family Guy simply moves on, episode after episode, season after season, like a river that does not care about the things you left on the bank when it went past. The show has a relationship to its own history that is best described as selective. Things that happened in previous episodes may or may not be referenced in subsequent ones, depending on whether the writers found them useful. Characters who died in episodes that were designated as canonical have appeared alive in later episodes without comment. Biographical facts that were established in one season have been contradicted in another. The show treats its own accumulated history the way Peter Griffin treats his responsibilities, as something that exists in principle but does not substantially constrain behavior. That town is Quahog, Rhode Island, The family is the Griffins. The show is Family Guy. Family Guy premiered on the 31st of January 1999, in the time slot immediately following Super Bowl 33. Fox had spent a considerable sum on the production and chose to place it in one of the highest viewership television moments of the entire year to guarantee maximum initial exposure. The gambit worked in the most immediate sense. That first episode, Death Has a Shadow, pulled in roughly 22 million viewers. For a brand new animated comedy pitched as an edgier alternative to what The Simpsons had been doing on Sunday nights for the previous decade, that was a remarkable number, though it was also a somewhat misleading one. The Super Bowl crowd is not the same as the regular audience. A percentage of viewers stay on the channel after a sporting event ends simply because changing it would require effort. But enough of them came back the following week, and enough of those came back the week after that, to establish that the show had found something real in its audience. The show was created by Seth MacFarlane, a young animator who had studied at the Rhode Island School of Design and worked at Hanna-Barbera on shows including Johnny Bravo and Cow and Chicken and Dexter's Laboratory before making 2 short animated films called The Life of Larry and Steve. Those shorts contained the direct genetic material of what would become Family Guy. Larry was a heavyset, not particularly bright man with a dog named Steve who was considerably more intelligent than him and who bore a relationship to Larry that mixed genuine affection with exasperated tolerance. If you watch the Larry films, which are available online and are worth watching for the specific experience of seeing a famous thing in its rough early form, the jump from Larry and Steve to Peter and Brian is immediate and obvious. The character types were already there, already producing the specific comedic chemistry that the show would develop and refine. MacFarlane took those characters, changed their names, built a family around them, pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox in May of 1998, received the green light, and the show that premiered on January 31st, 1999, was the result of that process. It has now been running for over 25 years. It survived 2 cancellations, the second of which seemed genuinely permanent before a combination of Adult Swim rerun ratings that exceeded what anyone in the industry had anticipated, and DVD sales that proved a deep and loyal audience existed, demonstrated that the audience for the show was larger, more committed, and more actively invested in its return than Fox had understood when it canceled it. It came back in 2005 for a 4th season that generated genuine cultural excitement of the kind that accompanies something returning from a place that most things in television do not return from. And then it kept going, season after season, past the point where most shows had exhausted themselves and their creative energy had clearly shifted from genuine expression into institutional momentum. Past the point where watching Season 1 and Season 20 in the same sitting produces a mild and persistent cognitive dissonance, a sense that you are watching 2 programs that share a visual style and a cast, but have fundamentally different relationships to the world and the characters they are depicting. This is not a discussion of the show's quality, or of the specific creative decisions that produce the difference between those 2 versions of it. The conversation about Family Guy's decline has been had thoroughly and loudly by a great many people over a great many years, and it is not what we are here for tonight. What we are here for is stranger and quieter and more interesting in the specific way that unanswered questions are interesting when they have been sitting unanswered long enough to acquire weight. Family Guy has been running for over 25 years, and in that time it has accumulated a remarkable and largely unintentional body of lore. Not intentionally, not in the way that a show designed to build an extended mythology would carefully and deliberately construct one. Family Guy's lore is the byproduct of a show that tells stories without thinking carefully about how those stories connect to each other across seasons, that writes characters without consistently maintaining records of what those characters have been established to be, and that drops pieces of information into its narrative, because the information is funny or useful in the immediate context of the episode being written without much consideration of what the information means for everything that has come before it or everything that will come after it. And what it means, when you actually sit down with the accumulated material and trace it carefully, is something considerably stranger and more interesting than the show itself ever consciously acknowledged or pursued. There are mysteries in Quahog, deep ones, the kind that sit at the foundation of the show and have been sitting there since the very beginning, so fundamental to the texture of the world that most viewers have stopped noticing them because they have been there for so long. The baby who should not be possible, The dog who cannot logically be what he is within any coherent framework. The chicken who refuses to die no matter what happens to him. The timeline that cannot be reconciled no matter how generously you approach the arithmetic of it. The family patriarch whose existence raises genuine questions about how justice functions in a fictional Rhode Island town. The dark fan theory about all of it that is more internally coherent than a fan theory built from a cartoon has any right to be. This is a sleep companion for those mysteries. We are going to move through them slowly and with care, the way you move through a town late at night when no one is watching and the lights are low, and you can look at the things that are usually obscured by the noise and motion of the day. There is no urgency here. The mysteries of Quahog have been waiting for over 25 years. They can wait a little longer while we settle in and let the night become comfortable around us. The water off the Rhode Island coast is calm tonight. The streets of Quahog are quiet. The Drunken Clam is technically still open, but it is the kind of open that is really just the lights not having been turned off yet. The last few people either having shuffled out or settled into a silence comfortable enough that no one is quite ready to disrupt it by standing up and ending the evening. Peter is on the couch, which is where he usually ends up after a certain point in the evening regardless of what the original plan was. Brian is at the kitchen table with a martini that is either his third or his fourth, depending on how you count the one he poured while nominally doing something else. Stewie is in his room, and his light is on under the door, and from behind that door comes the occasional sound of something mechanical and very precise, something that would alarm any reasonable person who knew what it was, which no one in the household does, which is the point. We begin with the strangest member of the household. We begin with Stuart Gilligan Griffin. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me what time it is where you are right now and where in the world you are listening from. It is genuinely one of my favorite things about making these companions. The knowledge that someone in Auckland, and someone in Glasgow, and someone in Sao Paulo, and someone in a small town in the middle of a country I have never visited are all in the same quiet place at the same time. There is something real and wonderful about that. If you have not subscribed yet, please do. It costs nothing. It takes 2 seconds, and it genuinely matters to a channel like this one. Now, let us talk about the baby. Section 2. The Stewie Problem, a baby with weapons and no explanation. Stuart Gilligan Griffin was 1 year old when Family Guy premiered in January of 1999. As of the most recent seasons, which aired in 2024 and 2025, Stuart Gilligan Griffin is still 1 year old. He has not turned 2. He has not learned to walk in the way that toddlers learn to walk, with that specific lurching forward momentum that looks like the child is chasing their own center of gravity. He has not moved through the developmental stages that pediatricians track and parents photograph. He remains exactly where he was at the beginning, 1 year old, wearing a yellow shirt and red overalls, sitting in a high chair or crawling across the kitchen floor or doing whatever the episode needs him to do, exactly as small and exactly as young as he was the first time anyone saw him. This is worth pausing on, because the show sometimes presents Stewie's arrested development as incidental, as though 1 year old is simply what he is in the same way that the color of his shirt is what it is. But the arrested development becomes genuinely strange when you put it alongside everything else the show has established about him, because the list of things Stuart Griffin can do, the list of things he has done on camera across more than 2 decades of broadcast television, is not the list of things a 1 year old baby can do. He has built a fully functional mind control device. Not a prototype, not a proof of concept. A working device, tested in the field with documented results. He constructed it in his bedroom from materials that the show has never adequately explained how a 1 year old obtained, which is itself a small mystery embedded inside the larger one. The bedroom in the Griffin house on Spooner Street is the kind of bedroom you would expect a 1 year old to have in a lower middle class household in Rhode Island. A crib, some toys, the general texture of a space being maintained for a child too small to have preferences about his own environment. And inside that bedroom, Stewie has built things that the defense departments of multiple nations have been unable to build, despite having essentially unlimited funding, and the collective engineering talent of entire academic and industrial ecosystems behind them. He built a time machine, not once. The time machine, or versions of it, has appeared across multiple episodes spanning multiple seasons. In the episode Road to the Multiverse, which aired in 2009, he and Brian use a device that allows them to move between parallel versions of the universe, visiting a version where Stewie's ancestor converted to Christianity and therefore altered all of Western civilization, visiting a version where the Japanese won the Second World War, visiting a version of the world rendered in the visual style of Disney animation of the 1950s, visiting a version of reality so degraded that it resembles a crude video game from the late 1980s. The device works. The parallel universes appear to be real, to have genuine internal consistency, to follow their own causal logic from a branching point that differs from the show's primary universe. Stewie built this. The one-year-old built this. He built ray guns that function. Not toys, not props, weapons that, in the show's internal logic, produce real energy discharge and real physical results when used. He has used them on Lois, on Brian, on characters who wandered into range. The ray guns have different settings and different effects. He maintains them. He improves them. He understands the engineering principles behind them at a level that implies not just technical literacy, but a genuine mastery of physics that goes well beyond anything taught at any level of formal education, including the highest levels, and certainly well beyond what any one-year-old on this planet has ever demonstrated. The in-universe explanation for none of this is ever provided. The show simply places Stewie in the high chair, zooms out to show the whole kitchen, and lets the gap between the high chair and the ray gun sitting on the kitchen counter exist without comment, because the gap between those two things is the joke, and explaining the gap would dissolve the joke, and so the explanation is never forthcoming. But the gap is real, and if you sit with it long enough, it starts to produce genuine and interesting questions. Where did the genius come from? One fan theory that has circulated for years and that has a kind of structural elegance to it proposes that Stewie is not cognitively exceptional in the way that the show presents him as being. The theory proposes instead that what we are seeing when we watch Stewie's scenes is not what is actually happening in the room. The adults in the household generally cannot understand Stewie. Lois hears babbling, Peter hears babbling, the people at the grocery store, the pediatrician, the teacher at school, they hear babbling. Brian, uniquely, hears actual words, can have actual conversations with Stewie, can follow his plans and his reasoning and his emotional state with a specificity that requires genuine comprehension. The theory suggests that Brian understands Stewie because Brian is not a dog, or not entirely a dog, and that the shared exceptionality between them explains the communication. But a more economical version of the theory simply suggests that Stewie is a normal baby and that everything we see in his scenes is imagined, either by Brian or by some authorial consciousness that the show contains without naming. This theory is interesting primarily because the show itself has experimented with versions of it. In an episode from the 4th season, a child psychologist evaluates Stewie and concludes that he is a perfectly normal baby with no signs of exceptional intelligence or unusual psychological development. The psychologist sees a baby. The audience sees what the baby actually is. The gap between those two things is never resolved, which is either a lazy piece of writing or a deliberately planted piece of information that the show is choosing not to follow through on, and the mystery is that we genuinely cannot be certain which of those two things it is. There is also the matter of the accent. Stewie Griffin speaks with a received pronunciation British accent. He sounds, specifically, like someone who was educated at a boarding school in the English countryside and then attended Oxford and has spent a great deal of time around people for whom that accent is the natural default. He sounds like a villain from a 1960s spy film who has been given an arts education and has decided to weaponize his diction. He does not sound like the child of Peter and Lois Griffin, two people whose New England working-class American English is consistent, stable, and not in any obvious way connected to received pronunciation British English. He does not sound like anyone who has ever lived on Spooner Street in Rhode Island. The show acknowledged this directly in the episode Stewie is in Science, which aired in the 14th season. Stewie visits a therapist and during their session, experiences a moment of vocal breakdown in which his received pronunciation accent gives way to a broad and unmistakably Rhode Island accent. The accent that comes out of him in this moment is raw and regional, and sounds absolutely nothing like the Stewie who has been speaking with crystalline British diction for 14 years. The therapist reacts. Stewie reacts. The audience is given, in that moment, the clear and explicit suggestion that the British accent is performed, that it is a construction, that underneath the received pronunciation is a real and regional American voice that Stewie has been deliberately and continuously suppressing. This is not a throwaway gag. The episode is built around this moment in a way that suggests intent. The implication is that Stewie, at some point before the show's narrative timeline even begins, made a decision to speak in a specific way, to perform a specific identity, and to maintain that performance so consistently that it became the only version of himself that his household ever encountered. A 1-year-old made this decision. A 1-year-old constructed a linguistic identity sophisticated enough to sustain across years of continuous interaction with people who should have been in a position to challenge it. A 1-year-old chose, deliberately and persistently, to be something other than what Rhode Island made him. The question of why is never answered. The show drops the information and keeps moving, because that is what Family Guy does with its most interesting material. But the information has been dropped, and it sits in the record, and it changes the texture of every Stewie scene that comes before it and after it once you know it is there. Then there is the question of the plans themselves. Stewie's stated goal in the early seasons of the show was world domination and the death of his mother. These were not idle ambitions. He built devices in service of them. He made attempts. He documented his plans with a specificity that suggested genuine commitment rather than the kind of abstract villainous aspiration that characters in lesser shows carry around as a character trait without ever taking seriously. In the Season 2 episode Da Boom, which showed a post-apocalyptic version of the world following a Y2K nuclear event, Stewie's response to the end of civilization was to immediately attempt to position himself as the ruler of whatever was left. This was not an impulsive decision. This was a rapid activation of contingency planning that he had already done. The 2-part 6th season story, Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, represented the closest the show ever came to following the early Stewie material to its logical conclusion. In those episodes, Stewie does what he said he would do. He kills Lois. He takes over the world. He becomes the dictator he always said he wanted to be. The episodes are dramatically effective in a way that surprised a lot of viewers because the show had spent several seasons softening Stewie, pulling him away from the villain material and toward the emotionally richer but significantly less original friendship storylines with Brian, and the sudden return to the hard version of what he actually was produced a genuine charge. And then the show revealed that it was a simulation. Stewie had been running a simulation on his computer. None of it actually happened. The world domination, the death of Lois, the global dictatorship, all of it was contained in a program that Stewie was running on hardware that he had built himself, in his bedroom, where he also stored the ray guns and the time machine and the mind control device. The simulation reveal is interesting for what it implies about the rest of the show. If Stewie can run a full and apparently photorealistic simulation of the Griffin household and of the geopolitical landscape and of the interior lives of all the people in his life, if he can simulate their responses to events with sufficient accuracy that the simulation is indistinguishable from reality even to an audience watching it from outside the narrative, then the question that the show never asks becomes the question that the theory cannot stop asking. Which parts of the show are also simulations? If the hardware exists, and we know it exists because we saw it, and if the software can produce an experience indistinguishable from the primary narrative, then the primary narrative itself becomes suspect in a way that the show never engaged with seriously, but that the more interesting fan theories have spent years unpacking. The baby in the yellow shirt and red overalls sits in the high chair and babbles in the direction of his parents. His light is on under the door late at night. The sounds coming from behind the door are precise and mechanical and entirely inconsistent with anything a 1-year-old should be doing at this hour or any hour. The mystery of Stewie Griffin is not what he is. The show has shown us what he is repeatedly and in considerable detail. The mystery is how, and from where, and whether anyone in the household with access to all the evidence they have been given is capable of putting it together in the way that the audience has been quietly putting it together for over 25 years. The answer, consistently, is no. And that answer is either the setup for a punchline that never arrives, or the most interesting piece of unexplained story that a cartoon has ever dropped and walked away from. Section 3. Brian Griffin. The dog who cannot logically exist. Brian H. Griffin is, by the show's own definition, a dog. He is a white Labrador mix who was adopted by the Griffin family years before the show's narrative timeline begins. He was found on the street. Peter brought him home. He became part of the household in the way that dogs become part of households, which is to say, gradually and then completely, until the household cannot quite remember what it was like before the dog was there. This much the show has established clearly. Everything else about Brian Griffin is considerably more complicated. Brian walks on two legs. He drives a car, specifically a 2004 Toyota Prius that the show has placed in the Griffin family driveway with enough consistency to constitute an established detail of his life. He drinks heavily. Martinis are his preference, with a particular attachment to a specific ratio of gin to vermouth that the show has referenced enough times to suggest it is not incidental. He has written, or attempted to write, a novel, and the novel has been a source of shame and aspiration and procrastination and occasional terrible progress for more episodes than any other single creative project in the show's history. He has attended Thanksgiving dinners. He has gone on dates with women. He has voted in elections. He has filed taxes in at least one episode, which is the kind of specific detail that raises more questions than it resolves. He has an ex-wife named Jillian and a son named Dylan who lives with Jillian in California, and about whom Brian has complicated feelings that the show has not always been consistent about exploring. He is 7 years old. In the show's internal logic, he is 7 years old. 7 dog years, which works out to approximately 49 human years, though the show's treatment of Brian's age and what it means has been flexible enough across its run that this calculation is more of a starting point for confusion than a resolution of it. He was born in Austin, Texas, to a mother named Biscuit who died after being hit by a car, which is established in the episode The Man with Two Brians from season 7, and who appears alive and well in a flashback in a later season, which is one of the show's more straightforward continuity failures, but which also serves as a small data point in the larger question about how seriously the show expects us to take any biographical information it provides about Brian. His earliest documented appearance in the show's narrative mythology is the short film The Life of Larry, created by Seth MacFarlane in 1995 while he was still a student. In that film, the dog is named Steve. He is white. He walks on two legs. He speaks in a voice that is recognizably MacFarlane's natural speaking voice, the voice he uses when he is not performing one of his character voices, which is a detail that the show has never quite let go of. Brian is the only major Griffin character voiced by MacFarlane in something close to his own voice. While Peter is performed in a broad character register, and Stewie is performed in the received pronunciation British accent, and Quagmire is performed in a specific mid-century American masculine register. Brian sounds like Seth MacFarlane talking. This is either just how things worked out, or it is a piece of deliberate self-insertion that the show has embedded in its own structure from the beginning, making Brian the character through whom MacFarlane speaks most directly, the character whose opinions and frustrations and intellectual pretensions most closely map to MacFarlane's own documented public positions. The fan theory that treats Brian as a version of MacFarlane himself, as a kind of author surrogate, through whom the show's creator is processing his own relationship to creative failure and social aspiration, and the specific discomfort of being the smartest person in a room full of people who are not paying attention to you, is not a particularly radical theory. It is the kind of theory that most thoughtful viewers arrive at independently without much difficulty. What is more interesting is the question of what it implies about the rest of the show, if Brian is the authorial consciousness, if Brian is the perspective through which everything else is being organized and presented. The Life of Brian theory, which is one of the more elaborate and internally consistent readings of the show that the fan community has produced, proposes that Family Guy is Brian's novel. Not a novel that exists in the show's universe, not a book that characters in the show could pick up and read, but the actual show itself, the content of the episodes, the narrative that the audience is watching, is Brian's attempt to write about his life and the people in it. Under this reading, the cutaway gags are Brian's digressions, the places where the narrative mind that is organizing the story wanders off into associations before returning to the main thread. The inconsistencies are the inconsistencies of memory and of fiction, the places where the story's author has not maintained perfect fidelity to the facts and has instead allowed imagination or wish fulfillment or unconscious bias to reshape the material. The Stewie who builds time machines and ray guns is not the actual Stewie, but Brian's romanticized version of the baby who looked at him with those large round eyes and seemed to understand things that babies are not supposed to understand. The The theory is unprovable in the way that all such theories about fictional worlds are unprovable, because fictional worlds do not have ground truth the way the physical world does. But it has a texture of internal consistency that rewards examination. If Brian is the author, then his own scenes in the novel are the scenes in which he is most obviously flattering himself. He is the voice of reason, the only truly intelligent person in the household, the one who would be a great writer if only the circumstances of his life had been different. This is exactly the kind of thing an author who is also a character in his own novel would tend to do, and it is also exactly what the show does with Brian across its early seasons. Before the character's writing became looser and less controlled, and the flattering self-portrait began to crack in ways that the show's later Brian material represents. There is also the matter of Brian's survival of things that should demonstrably have killed him. In the season 12 episode, Life of Brian, he is hit by a car. The show treats this as a genuine and permanent death. The family mourns. Stewie is devastated in a way that functions as a measure of how much the show understood the emotional weight of the Brian and Stewie relationship at its best. A new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico from The Sopranos, is brought into the household. The death is presented as real and final, and the kind of narrative choice that a show makes when it is genuinely trying to move forward. 2 episodes later, Stewie uses a time travel device to go back to the moment of Brian's death and prevent the car from hitting him. Brian comes back. Everything resets. The death, the grief, the new dog, all of it is retroactively erased. Vinny disappears from the narrative as though he was never there, which is its own small cruelty to a character who had barely gotten started. The resurrection is the most explicit demonstration of the show's relationship to consequence. Things that happen in Family Guy do not necessarily mean what they appear to mean, because the show has the option of undoing them whenever the undoing is more convenient than maintaining the change. Brian died and returned. The death was real enough to generate significant viewer response, including genuine distress from a section of the audience. Enough distress that the return was treated as a welcome relief rather than a narrative cheat. But the fact that the return was possible, and that it was executed so quickly and with so little apparent cost, tells you something about the world Brian inhabits. It is a world in which death is not necessarily permanent, in which the rules of physical reality are negotiable, and in which the dog who cannot logically exist by the standards of the world's own biology is also a dog who cannot logically die by the standards of the world's own established consequences. Brian Griffin is 7 years old, and has been 7 years old for over 25 years. He is a dog who votes and drives and nurses a martini and lies about how close he is to finishing his novel. He was found on the street and brought home, and has been on the couch on Spooner Street ever since, which is either the most ordinary thing about him or, depending on how you look at it, the strangest thing of all. Section 4. The chicken feud that should have destroyed the world. His name is Ernie the giant chicken. He is roughly Peter Griffin's height, which puts him at somewhere between 5 feet 10 and 6 feet tall, and he is a rooster, which is to say he is a male chicken with the red comb and the feathers and the beak and everything that the word chicken reliably conjures. He first appeared in the Season 2 episode Da Boom, which was itself a somewhat chaotic episode involving the Y2K apocalypse and Stewie's immediate attempts to fill the resulting power vacuum, but his introduction was not the apocalypse. His introduction was a coupon. Peter was given a coupon by Ernie the giant chicken. The coupon was expired. Peter took offense at the expired coupon in the way that Peter takes offense at things, which is to say with an immediacy and a totality that bypassed any rational evaluation of the situation and went directly to the kind of response that most people would not consider proportionate to receiving an expired coupon. They fought. The fight was enormous. The fight involved property damage at a scale that would take weeks and significant resources to assess and repair. Buildings were damaged, vehicles were involved, multiple locations across the town sustained impacts from the specific and violent trajectory of 2 large figures moving through them at speed while engaged in a sustained physical confrontation. Peter won. Ernie appeared to be dead. Ernie came back. In the episode I Take the Quagmire from Season 4, Ernie reappeared without explanation, alive and apparently recovered from whatever state he had been in since the Da Boom fight. They fought again. The fight was longer and more elaborate and more destructive than the first one. It moved through more locations. It involved more collateral damage. It was again resolved with Peter as the apparent victor and Ernie in a state that appeared to be fatal. Ernie came back again. He has appeared in fights with Peter across multiple seasons, each fight following roughly the same structural template: an inciting incident that connects back to the original coupon grievance or that establishes some new provocation that is presented as equivalent, an escalating physical confrontation that covers significant geography, a resolution that appears final, and then, some number of episodes or seasons later, a return that requires no explanation because the show has decided not to offer one. The fights themselves are worth examining on their own terms, independent of the larger mystery, because they are genuinely distinctive pieces of animation. They are extended action sequences in a show that does not primarily produce action sequences, and the creative energy that goes into them is visible in the way that creative energy is sometimes visible in a piece of work that the people making it were genuinely enjoying. The choreography is specific. The escalation is logical, within its own parameters. There is a rhythm to each fight that builds in a way that feels intentional, with moments of rest and moments of acceleration, and a general sense that the thing is being constructed rather than improvised. If you watch only the chicken fight sequences, removing them from their surrounding episodes and watching them as standalone objects, they hold together in a way that the episodes they come from do not always hold together. The geographic scope of the fights is one of their most striking qualities. The first fight, in Da Boom, covered a significant portion of what was visible of Quahog. The later fights expanded to include locations outside the town. At various points during the extended sequences, the two of them have moved through an airport terminal, a hotel that appeared to be hosting some kind of event, a construction site, an active road, and a location that appeared to be well outside Quahog's city limits based on the surrounding landscape. They have moved through these spaces while the spaces were occupied by other people, who have been variously knocked over, slammed into, disrupted, and used as incidental obstacles in a confrontation that had nothing to do with them. The civilian casualty rate of the chicken fights, if you were to take the show's physical rules seriously and treat each impact as a real impact with real consequences for real people, would be substantial. Which raises the question of who Ernie is, exactly, beyond the surface explanation that he is a giant chicken who gave Peter an expired coupon. The show has never provided a biography for Ernie. He does not have a home that the show has visited. He does not have a family that has been introduced, though there is a wife who has appeared in at least one sequence. He does not have a job, or if he has a job, the show has not found it interesting enough to establish. He exists, in the show's narrative, almost entirely as the occasion for the fights. When he is not fighting Peter, he is not really present. He occupies no storylines, he advances no plots. He is the collision point for an inexhaustible and geographically mobile grievance, and then he goes somewhere and waits. What the fan community has spent considerable energy on is the question of why Ernie keeps surviving. The fights end with him in states that should be fatal. He has been dropped from significant heights. He has been in explosions. He has been submerged. He has experienced impacts that the show's own physical logic suggests should not be recoverable from. And then he recovers. He shows up again. He is recognizably the same Ernie, carrying the same grievance or the same willingness to re-engage the grievance, undeterred by the previous outcomes. One theory that has circulated, and that has the quality of all good fan theories, in that it is simultaneously absurd and more internally consistent than it has any right to be, proposes that Ernie and Peter are engaged in something that neither of them fully understands: a contract or a curse, or a consequence of the show's physical rules that forces them to keep returning to each other. Under this theory, the coupon was not just a coupon. The original transaction between them, the moment when Ernie handed Peter the expired coupon and the confrontation began, created a loop that neither of them can exit. The fights will keep happening because something in the structure of the world they inhabit requires them to keep happening. Ernie survives because the loop needs him to survive. Peter survives because the loop needs him to survive. The destruction is real and it affects real people and it generates real consequences for the world around them. But for the two of them, the loop is the constraint that matters. This theory is, to be clear, not supported by anything the show has explicitly done. It is a reading of a pattern, and the pattern it is reading is one that the show produced not through deliberate construction, but through a combination of comedic instinct and institutional repetition. The first chicken fight was funny. The second chicken fight was funnier for being a callback. The third chicken fight was, at minimum, a reliable structural event. By the fourth and fifth and sixth, the fights had become part of the show's mythology in a way that the show felt obligated to honor even as it continued to escalate them. The show created a cycle and then became bound by it in the way that all long-running shows become bound by the expectations they generate in their audience. But the cycle exists, and within the cycle, Ernie the giant chicken cannot die, and Peter Griffin cannot stop fighting him, and the town of Quahog continues to sustain collateral damage from confrontations that began with an expired coupon and have never quite resolved to a point where either party can call the matter settled. The fights are spectacular. The mystery is small and specific, and sits at the center of each one. Why does Ernie survive? And what does the show actually think it is saying when it brings him back? The show does not know, or does not say, which amounts to the same thing from the outside. Ernie is out there tonight, in whatever place Ernie goes between fights. His wife is presumably nearby. The grievance is presumably intact. Peter is on the couch, and the couch is stable, and nothing is currently on fire. But the next time the two of them end up in the same space, the loop will activate, and whatever came before it will be set aside for the duration, and the destruction will begin again from the beginning, because it always does. Section 5. Meg's real father and the secret the whole family kept. The Megan Griffin problem is embedded inside the larger Peter Griffin problem, which is embedded inside the larger question of what the Griffin household is actually held together by, and tracing it requires going back to a piece of information that the show dropped in its third season, and then spent approximately 19 more seasons, not quite knowing how to deal with. In the Season 3 episode Screwed the Pooch, the show establishes that Lois Griffin had a relationship with a man named Stan Thompson before she was with Peter. This is not particularly shocking as backstory goes, because most people have had relationships before their current ones, and a backstory relationship for Lois is exactly the kind of normal biographical texture that a show might provide for a character to make her feel more fully realized. It would be unremarkable if it stayed there. It does not stay there. The show establishes, across subsequent episodes, that the relationship between Lois and Stan Thompson was not fully resolved before Lois became involved with Peter. And then, across those same subsequent episodes, it deposits a collection of small and individually dismissible details that begin, when viewed together, to assemble themselves into a picture of something the show is either deliberately building toward or has stumbled into without quite realizing what it has done. The timing of Meg's birth. The specific quality of Peter's behavior toward Meg when that behavior is compared to his behavior toward Chris and Stewie. The way Lois sometimes reacts to Meg with a particular kind of protectiveness that does not quite match the general emotional texture of their relationship. The way Meg looks compared to the rest of the family, a detail that the show has used for comedy, but that takes on a different quality when you start counting the dissimilarities. The Season 22 premiere, which brought Stan Thompson back and placed him in a scene with the Griffin family in a way that the show appeared to be setting up as a significant narrative event before backing away from it in the manner that Family Guy backs away from. Things it has set up whenever following through would require a level of narrative commitment the show has generally been reluctant to make. Stan Thompson, as established by the show, is handsome in a specific and deliberate way. The kind of handsome that is constructed by the show to register as a contrast with Peter's not handsomeness. He is successful. He is confident. He is, in the specific and narrow terms that the show uses to evaluate male characters, everything that Peter is not. The relationship he had with Lois is described in ways that suggest it was serious enough that its ending was not entirely clean, that there were feelings that did not fully resolve when the relationship formally ended, and that Lois's subsequent relationship with Peter began in proximity to the end of whatever she had with Stan. The fan theory that Meg is Stan Thompson's biological daughter rather than Peter's is not a fringe reading. It has circulated widely enough and been engaged with seriously enough by the portion of the fan community that takes the show's internal logic seriously that it qualifies as one of the established competing interpretations of the show's material. The evidence for it is circumstantial, which is the nature of evidence in a show that does not commit to things cleanly, but it is the right kind of circumstantial. It is consistent. It explains things that the show's official position does not fully explain, and it produces a reading of several scenes that makes more sense under the theory than it does without it. Consider the specific texture of Peter's cruelty toward Meg. The show has done a significant amount of work to establish Peter as an indiscriminate force of low-grade domestic chaos, someone whose selfishness and poor judgment affect everyone in his orbit without meaningful distinction. But his treatment of Meg has a quality that his treatment of Chris and Stewie does not quite share. The contempt for Meg is more personal, more consistent, and more specifically focused on her existence as a presence in the household rather than on her behavior or her choices. Peter does dumb and harmful things to Chris and Stewie too, but those things tend to arise from specific situations or from Peter's impulsive decision-making in the moment. His treatment of Meg feels more like a standing disposition, a settled conclusion that predates any specific incident, a posture, rather than a series of responses. If Meg is not Peter's biological daughter, then Peter's behavior toward her reads differently, not better, and not justified by any standard that a reasonable person would apply, but differently. The contempt becomes less random and more rooted. The specific quality of his dismissal of her, the way he sometimes looks through her rather than at her, the way his baseline assumption about Meg appears to be that she is a source of inconvenience rather than a person with whom he has a fundamental biological bond, becomes at least explicable if not forgivable under a reading in which his relationship to her is not the relationship a father has to his daughter, but something stranger and more uncomfortable, the relationship a man has to a daily reminder of something he would prefer not to think about. Lois's behavior toward Meg is the more interesting data point, because Lois is the constant in the biological question regardless of how it resolves. If Meg is Stan's daughter, Lois knows this. Lois has always known this. And the specific texture of Lois's protectiveness toward Meg, the way she sometimes steps between Peter and Meg in a way that feels less like a mother mediating between a father and a child, and more like a mother placing herself between a man and a person. The man has a specific and focused hostility toward, reads differently under that framework. The show has never confirmed the theory. In the season 22 premiere, Stan Thompson appears, and Meg meets him, and the show builds a scene in a way that suggests it is aware of the theory and is either going to address it or use the audience's awareness of it as a comedic beat. What the show actually does with that scene is neither, exactly. It acknowledges the possibility and then doesn't follow through, leaving the question in the ambiguous space where Family Guy leaves most of its interesting questions, available to the audience as a reading but not confirmed as the show's official position. This is consistent with how the show has always handled Meg. Meg is interesting when the show allows itself to be interested in her. She is interesting in Barely Legal, the season 5 episode where her attachment to Brian, following his charitable gesture of accompanying her to prom, reveals something genuine about her loneliness and her capacity for feeling. She is interesting in Seahorse Seashell Party, where her speech to her family catalogs the specific damage their treatment of her has done, and where the show's decision to resolve the episode by having her voluntarily return to the role of punching bag for the household's benefit is the most troubling creative choice the show ever made about her character. She is interesting in the season 14 episode that explores the cycle of abuse between Peter and his sister and establishes a framework for understanding why the family's treatment of Meg has the specific quality it does. But the show's interest in Meg has never been sustained long enough to resolve the interesting questions it raises about her. The Stan Thompson material is the most significant of those questions because it sits at the foundation of her identity in the show's universe. Who her father is affects who she is. The show raised the question and then chose to keep it open, either because the writers found the ambiguity more useful than a resolution, or because they raised it without fully thinking about what they were raising and then felt the resolution was more commitment than they were prepared to make. Meg Griffin is 17. She has been 17 for over 25 years. She goes to school and she comes home and she is treated badly, and she absorbs it and the next episode begins. But the question of who she actually is, biologically, and therefore in terms of the household's complicated emotional architecture, sits under all of it, unresolved, waiting. Section 6. Peter Griffin, the man who should be in prison. There is a standard in American criminal law called actus reus, which is the requirement that a crime consist of an actual act, something done rather than merely thought or intended. Peter Griffin has committed, across the documented broadcast history of Family Guy, a comprehensive catalog of actual acts that would satisfy the actus reus requirement for a remarkable number of serious criminal offenses under the laws of the state of Rhode Island and under the federal laws of the United States of America. This is not hyperbole. This is an assessment of what the show has depicted on camera, treated as comedy, and resolved without meaningful consequence. Peter has, across the show's run, driven a vehicle while intoxicated on multiple documented occasions. Rhode Island law treats operating under the influence as a criminal matter, not a civil one, meaning that the documented incidents are not license violations but criminal offenses. He has caused property damage while intoxicated that rises well above the threshold at which Rhode Island law requires criminal rather than civil disposition. He has caused physical injury to other people in contexts that do not qualify as accidents, meaning the injury resulted from intentional acts performed without consent from the people who sustained them. He has held people against their will, which is the definition of unlawful detention regardless of what the purpose of the detention was or how long it lasted. He has made threats of violence against specific individuals that were credible enough to cause those individuals to take defensive action, which is the definition of criminal threatening under Rhode Island law. The episode Baby It's Cold Inside sits in the record as one of the show's clearest depictions of something that should have generated a criminal investigation. Peter and Lois are on a boat on the water. Peter sees what he believes to be a shark approaching the boat. His response is to physically push Lois into the water and then flee in the boat, leaving her in what he believed to be a shark attack. The object was not a shark but a dolphin. This matters enormously for what actually happened to Lois, which was nothing fatal. It matters not at all for the question of what Peter did, because what Peter did was attempt to use his wife as a shield against a perceived threat, abandon her to what he understood to be a potentially fatal situation, and flee without looking back. That is not a bad decision made in a panic. That is a specific, directed act with a specific intended consequence. The Seahorse Seashell Party episode, which aired in the 10th season and which has been discussed at length in relation to Meg, contains within Meg's speech to her family a partial inventory of Peter's specific offenses against her that is worth examining for its precision. She tells him that he shoves her face into his rear end and passes gas on it, which is a specific description of a specific repeated act. She tells him that if someone from the outside world could see how he treats her, he would be in jail. The show acknowledges, through Meg's speech, that the conduct it has been depicting as comedy would be classified as criminal by an external observer applying external standards. This acknowledgement is not followed by any change in Peter's behavior or any consequence for the behavior that has been catalogued. The show makes the acknowledgement and then continues. Joe Swanson is Peter's neighbor and one of his close friends. Joe is a police officer, which means he is a law enforcement officer in the jurisdiction in which Peter's documented criminal behavior has been occurring. Joe has been present for or immediately adjacent to a number of incidents that, under the standards his profession requires him to apply, he should have reported, investigated, or acted upon. His failure to do so over the course of the show's run is either an institutional failure on Joe's part or evidence that the town of Quahog operates with a relationship to its own law enforcement that is more complicated than it initially appears. The simplest explanation is that the show does not take Peter's crimes seriously because the show is a cartoon, and cartoons are not courtrooms, and the purpose of Peter's behavior is comedy rather than realistic portrayal of the consequences of repeated criminal conduct. This explanation is entirely correct and also somewhat beside the point, because the accumulated record of what Peter has done is real within the show's internal logic, and the gap between that record and the show's complete indifference to any consequences, for it is one of the most persistent and strange features of its 25-year existence. There is a more interesting version of this question, which is not whether Peter should be in prison, but why he is not. The question of why has a different texture than the question of whether, because it requires thinking about the institutional environment of Quahog in ways that reveal how little the show has developed that environment beyond its usefulness as a background for Peter's activities. The police department exists but does not consistently function. The mayor exists, but the political governance of the town appears to have no effect on the day-to-day reality of its residents. The legal system exists as a backdrop for episodes that require legal proceedings, but does not generate the kind of cumulative institutional attention that Peter's documented history should, by any reasonable standard, have generated by now. The absence of consequence for Peter's behavior is one of the clearest expressions of the show's fundamental relationship to reality. Things happen in Quahog. People are affected by those things, and then the episode ends and the next one begins and the ledger is cleared. This is a standard feature of episodic television, and not unique to Family Guy. But Family Guy's Peter has been doing this for over 25 years, with a consistency and a severity that most other shows' characters have not matched. And the accumulated weight of that record, the sheer volume of documented incidents sitting in the archive and waiting to be inventoried, creates a picture of something genuinely strange, not just in the category of episodic television's general relationship to consequence, but in the specific and particular case of this man in this town who has been doing these things since January of 1999. Peter Griffin is sitting on the couch in Quahog, Rhode Island tonight, as he has been sitting on the couch in Quahog, Rhode Island on every night of the show's run. He is watching television. He will do something terrible next episode, and the episode will resolve, and the ledger will be cleared, and he will be back on the couch, and the terrible thing will be filed alongside the previous terrible things in an archive that the show constructed without quite meaning to, and that no one in the town where he lives appears to be consulting. Section 7. The Peter is Imagining Everything Theory. In August of 2012, a Reddit user posted a theory about Family Guy in the Fan Theories subreddit. The theory proposed a reading of the show's entire narrative structure that was, depending on your tolerance for this kind of speculative reading, either a remarkably elegant explanation for a wide range of the show's most persistent inconsistencies, or an example of the kind of pattern matching that human minds perform on random data when they are looking for structure. The theory did not go viral immediately. It circulated in fan communities, was discussed and refined and challenged, and then in late 2022, it found its way to a new audience through short video platforms, where it generated the kind of renewed interest that happens when a piece of fan analysis reaches an audience that has not encountered it before. The theory in its most commonly stated form is this: Peter Griffin is severely mentally ill, and the world of Family Guy is not the objective reality of its characters, but Peter's subjective experience of a life that is considerably more ordinary and considerably more constrained than the show depicts. Under this reading, Peter is not a working-class man with an extraordinary household. He is a patient or a man in some institutional or constrained setting whose mind has constructed an elaborate alternative version of his life in which he is the center of events that are strange and funny and consequential rather than whatever the real events of his life actually are. The evidence cited by the theory's proponents is drawn from within the show's material rather than imposed from outside it, which is what gives it the texture of a real reading rather than a fanciful imposition. The cutaway gags, which are one of the show's signature structural features, are cited as evidence that the narrative consciousness organizing the story is prone to involuntary association, to sudden departures from the present moment into memories or fantasies or fears that have no obvious connection to what was happening immediately before them. This is a recognizable pattern in certain kinds of cognitive disruption. The mind under significant stress, or under the influence of certain medications, or in the grip of certain dissociative experiences, can move between states with a suddenness and a non-sequitur quality that the cutaway gag format precisely mirrors. The character of Stewie, under this reading, is Peter's unconscious. The baby who wants to kill his mother and take over the world is the part of Peter's own psychology that he cannot consciously access or acknowledge. The rage and the ambition and the grandiosity that have nowhere to go in Peter's actual life, and therefore find expression in the elaborate fantasy of the infant genius. The baby's mother is Lois, who is also Peter's wife in the fantasy, and the baby's desire to kill his mother is Peter's own complex of feelings about Lois, or about the real woman who occupies whatever role Lois fills in the reality that the theory proposes underlies the show's surface. Brian, under this reading, is Peter's idealized self. The version of Peter that drinks martinis instead of beer, and reads literature instead of watching television, and has opinions about politics and culture that are coherent and consistently applied, even if their application is sometimes hypocritical. Brian is who Peter would be if he were better, more articulate, more educated, more socially capable. The fact that Brian is a dog in the fantasy is, under the theory, a piece of self-deprecation embedded in the construction. Even in Peter's ideal version of himself, he is still, fundamentally, an animal, still guided by appetites and instincts, and the desire for simple physical comfort even when he is pretending to be something more refined. The chicken fights are, under this reading, Peter's most direct external expression of his own rage. Ernie is not a real giant chicken. Ernie is a figure from Peter's life, or from Peter's mind, who represents whatever Peter is most angry about, and the fights are the fantasy version of what Peter would do if his anger had physical form and physical permission. The fights are elaborate and destructive and occasionally beautiful in the specific way that fantasy violence is beautiful, which is to say, they are the violence that we imagine when we allow ourselves to imagine violence without any of the real consequences that constrain imagination when it gets close to something that might actually happen. The theory was picked up and discussed on YouTube channels and podcasts and forums in 2022 and 2023 with a renewed enthusiasm that suggested it had found a new generation of viewers who were encountering the material fresh. The discussions typically generated a mix of genuine engagement with the theory's internal logic and skeptical pushback from viewers who felt that applying a psychological framework to a cartoon was the kind of thing that looked more interesting from a distance than it was on close inspection. The skeptical case is worth taking seriously. Family Guy does not behave like a show that is consciously constructing a psychological narrative. The inconsistencies that the theory explains as features of a disturbed psychology are more straightforwardly explained as the inevitable byproduct of a show written by many different people over many years without consistent maintenance. Of a continuity Bible, which is not a conspiracy but just how television production works at scale. The cutaway gags are not evidence of dissociation. They are a comedic format that McFarlane developed from his earlier work, and that became the show's signature device. The characters are not psychological constructs of a central consciousness. They are characters with their own histories and motivations and voices. However, inconsistently, those voices have been maintained. But the theory does not need to be literally true to be interesting. What makes it worth sitting with, in the specific and quiet way that we sit with things at this hour of the night, is that it asks a genuine question about the nature of what the show is doing when it presents its material. Family Guy is a show about a man. The man is at the center. The world of the show is organized around his experiences and his relationships and his choices. Everything that happens in Quahog happens in some relation to Peter, directly or through the people who are in his orbit. The show's gravitational field is Peter. If that is true, then the question of what kind of consciousness is organizing what we see when we watch the show is a real question. The answer the show gives, implicitly, is that it is the consciousness of a neutral narrator, the same kind of consciousness that organizes most television, standing outside the characters and presenting them without bias. The theory suggests a different answer, that the organizing consciousness is Peter himself, that we are inside his experience rather than watching it from outside, and that the gap between the show's world and any realistic version of the world it superficially resembles is the gap between Peter's experience of his own life and what his life actually is. That gap is wide. It has been wide for over 25 years, and the width of it, the particular quality of the distance between what the show presents and what any realistic version of its premises would look like, is the evidence that the theory keeps returning to, the thing that it points at and says, this is not nothing. This has a shape. The shape has a name. The name the theory gives it is Peter's mind. Whether or not you accept that naming, the shape is real, and it has been there since the beginning, and it has never been adequately explained by any other reading. Section 8. Quagmire's age, his past, and the things the show never explained. Glenn Quagmire is 61 years old. This was established in the episode Quagmire's Baby, which aired in the 8th season, when the show provided his age as part of the episode's character material. 61 is an unusual age for a primetime animated comedy character in the role that Quagmire occupies, which is the role of the sexually successful neighbor and friend whose comedic function is built primarily around his romantic and physical activity with women. Characters in that role tend to be written as middle-aged in a vague and unspecified sense, old enough to have experience but young enough that their continued active pursuit of romantic and physical engagements does not produce a dissonance that the show has to manage. 61 is specific enough that the dissonance is worth noting. The show established his age clearly enough that it cannot be treated as a casual or throwaway detail. And yet, the implications of his being 61 years old, in a show where he was presumably not born 61 years old, creates interesting questions when placed alongside the show's otherwise frozen time approach to its characters. The show also established, in the episode Running Mates from Season 2, that Quagmire attended high school with Peter, which means that at some point during the show's backstory, Quagmire and Peter were the same age, or at minimum in the same general range of adolescence at the same time. If Quagmire is 61 in the episode that established his age, and if Peter attended high school with him, then Peter should also be approximately 61, or at least substantially older than the episode-to-episode presentation of Peter would suggest. The show does not reconcile this. The show never reconciles its age and timeline material, because the show's relationship to time is one of its most consistently managed inconsistencies. Characters are the ages that the show needs them to be for the purposes of the episode being written. When a specific number is given, it is given in service of a joke or a character beat, and the downstream implications of that specific number for the show's broader continuity are not the problem that the writers are solving in that room on that day. But the number is in the record. 61 is the number, and the number, once deposited, sits in the show's accumulated material and interacts with everything else in ways that the show did not plan for. Quagmire's Navy background is another piece of established material that the show dropped and did not fully develop. Several episodes reference his time in the United States Navy. He is described as having served, as having training, as having a background that would, in a more conventionally structured drama, explain a great deal about the specific quality of his self-confidence and his comfort with physical confrontation. The Navy material is referenced when it is useful for a joke or a storyline, and set aside when it would create complications for the show's preferred version of Quagmire, which is the version whose entire existence is organized around his sexual activity. In the episode Jerome is the New Black from Season 8, Quagmire delivers a speech to Brian that has become, in the fan community's collective memory, one of the show's most memorable pieces of character writing. The speech is a direct and detailed articulation of why Quagmire dislikes Brian, and it covers Brian's pretension, his hypocrisy, his failure as a writer, his inappropriate pursuit of Lois, his abandonment of his son, and his fundamental dishonesty about who and what he actually is. The speech is remarkable partly for its emotional force, which is greater than the show's typical register for this kind of character confrontation, and partly for its accuracy, which is the quality that gives the force its foundation. Everything Quagmire says in the speech is supported by things the show has actually depicted. He is not exaggerating or inventing grievances. He is cataloging. The Quagmire who delivers that speech is not the Quagmire of the Giggity Gag, the one-note character whose catchphrase has become so associated with him that new viewers often have difficulty seeing past it to the more complicated material underneath. The Quagmire of the Jerome is the New Black speech is someone who has been paying close attention to the people around him, who has formed precise and considered opinions about their characters and their failings, and who has sufficient verbal ability and emotional intelligence to articulate those opinions with devastating specificity when the occasion finally presents itself. This is a different character from the one the show most often presents, and the gap between those two versions of Quagmire is one of the show's more interesting unexplored territories. His daughter, Anna Lee Quagmire, was introduced in the Season 8 episode Quagmire's Baby and appeared in later episodes including Quagmire's Quagmire in Season 12. The daughter material represented one of the show's more sustained attempts to develop Quagmire past his primary comedic function, giving him a parental relationship with its own complications and emotional textures. The show has been inconsistent about how seriously it wants to take this material, moving between using Anna Lee as the occasion for genuinely affecting character moments and using her as a background detail that the show can reference or ignore depending on whether she is useful in a given episode. The age question, the Navy background, the daughter, the capacity for the kind of precise emotional intelligence demonstrated in the Brian speech, these are the pieces of a character who is significantly more developed than the character the show most often chooses to present. They coexist with the Giggity Gag and the endless stream of sexual conquest material in a way that the show has never attempted to organize into a coherent whole. The result is a Quagmire who is, at 61 years old and counting, simultaneously the show's most one-dimensional recurring character and one of the most interesting people in Quahog when the show is paying enough attention to remember all of what it has established about him. He lives across the street from the Griffins. His lights are off at this hour. Whatever he is doing at this hour, the show is not currently interested in it. The speech he gave Brian is in the record. The daughter is somewhere. The Navy training is somewhere. The 61 years are somewhere. All of it is there, waiting for an episode that wants to use it, which may or may not ever arrive. Section 9. The timeline problem. When does Family Guy actually take place? Family Guy premiered in January of 1999. The episodes in the first season were set, in the ordinary way of primetime television, in something like the present, the same present that the audience was watching from, with references to contemporary events and contemporary technology and contemporary culture that place the show in a recognizable version of the late 1990s. This is standard for episodic television. You set your show in the time you are making it, because the time you are making it is the time you know, the time your audience knows, and the shared present is the easiest ground to build on. The problem that this creates for a show that runs for over 25 years is one that Family Guy shares with The Simpsons and with every other long-running animated series that set itself in a specific present and then kept going past the point where that specific present had become the past. The characters do not age. The children who were children in 1999 are still children in 2024. Meg is perpetually 17. Chris is perpetually 13 or 14. Stewie is perpetually 1. Peter and Lois are somewhere in their mid-30s or early 40s, which is where they have been since the beginning and where they will remain. This is the floating present convention, the approach that long-running animated shows use to avoid the narrative complications that come with character aging while still being able to set episodes in what is nominally the current moment. The Simpsons has used it since the early 1990s and has become so practiced at it that most viewers accept it as a basic feature of animated television rather than a narrative strategy with its own implications. Family Guy uses the same convention, but uses it more carelessly than The Simpsons, in the sense that Family Guy has been less consistent about maintaining the fictional cover under which the floating present operates. The Simpsons rarely shows its characters at specific past moments that contradict the floating present logic. Family Guy has shown its characters at specific past moments repeatedly, in flashback sequences and in episodes structured around backstory, and those specific past moments create arithmetic problems that the show cannot resolve without acknowledging the floating present convention more explicitly than it wants to. In Back to the Pilot, the season 10 episode in which Brian and Stewie use a time machine to travel back to the events of the show's first episode, the show places its current characters in visual juxtaposition with the 1,999 versions of those same characters. The current Stewie and Brian can observe the 1,999 Stewie and Brian. The episode makes comedy out of the visual differences between the 1,999 animation style and the current animation style, which is one of the more self-aware moments in the show's history. But it also places two versions of the same characters in the same space at the same time, which requires the episode to maintain some position on the relationship between the show's present and its 1,999 past. The position the episode takes is vague enough to sidestep the arithmetic while still making the joke work, which is the kind of careful imprecision that the show is reasonably good at when it needs to be. The problem becomes more acute when specific years are mentioned. There are episodes in which characters reference specific years as the present, or in which events are dated to specific years, and those specific years, taken together, do not form a coherent chronology. Characters have had experiences that, given their established ages, should have happened at points in their personal histories that contradict the years in which those experiences are dated. The ages given for characters in specific episodes contradict the ages implied by the timeline of events that those same characters have been part of. The show's past, when examined carefully, does not add up to a coherent progression toward its present. The James Woods problem is a specific and well-documented instance of the larger timeline issue. The real James Woods, the actor, has appeared in Family Guy across multiple episodes. His first appearance was in the Season 4 episode Peter's Got Woods, in which he interacts with the Griffin family and becomes the subject of a plotline involving his name appearing on a high school. He died in the Season 9 episode And Then There Were Fewer, which was presented as a special event episode intended to function as canonical within the show's continuity. Characters who attended the dinner at which James Woods died are depicted as experiencing the consequences of his death. The episode's narrative treats the death as real and permanent within the show's universe. James Woods has appeared alive in subsequent episodes. The show has not explained how the James Woods who died at the dinner party in Season 9 is the same James Woods who appears in later episodes. The most charitable reading is that the episodes in which he appears after his death are set before his death in the show's chronology, But the show does not support this reading with any evidence, and does not appear to have thought about it carefully enough to make it coherent if you try to reconstruct the timeline. The floating present creates additional complications when the show makes reference to technology, because technology is one of the areas where time is most visibly marked. The specific versions of technology that appear in various episodes place those episodes in identifiable technological moments. The shift from the desktop computers of the early seasons to the smartphones of the later ones is a piece of visible evidence about when those episodes were made, and it interacts uneasily with a show that insists its characters have not aged while clearly depicting them in a world that has moved forward in time. Peter is the same age he was in 1999, but he now has a smartphone, which implies that time has passed even as the show maintains that for Peter, it has not. The show has occasionally tried to engage with its own timeline problem, usually through the self-aware comedic approach that is the show's default mode for acknowledging its own contradictions. Back to the Pilot is the clearest example. The episode knows what it is doing when it sends Stewie and Brian back to 1999, and it knows that the audience knows what it is doing, and the comedy of the episode depends partly on shared acknowledgement of the strangeness of a show revisiting its own origin, from a present that has not aged, but that is clearly several decades past that origin. The mystery of when Family Guy takes place is, ultimately, the mystery of what the show thinks time is. For the Griffins, time does not move in the way that time moves for the audience watching them. Events happen. Consequences occur, briefly. The ledger clears. It is January 1999 again. It is also 2024. Both of these things are simultaneously true in Quahog in the specific way that contradictory things can be simultaneously true in a place that exists outside the ordinary constraints of temporal reality, which is to say, in a fictional universe that was built without a clock and has never quite managed to install one. Section 10. Stewie's British accent and the real voice beneath it. There is a scene in the 14th season of Family Guy in which Stewie Griffin, while sitting in a therapist's office, loses control of his voice. The loss is specific and sudden and startling even if you have been told it is coming. Stewie is speaking in the received pronunciation British accent that has been the only voice anyone has ever heard from him across 14 years of the show's existence. The accent is a thoroughgoing performance, not just the vowels and consonants of received pronunciation, but the whole texture of it. The rhythm and the pacing and the particular relationship to emphasis that marks the accent as belonging to a specific class and educational background and relationship to English as a cultural inheritance. Stewie speaks received pronunciation the way someone speaks it, who has been speaking it for so long that it has become automatic, who no longer thinks about the accent because the accent is the voice, or at least that is how it appears. And then, in that therapist's office, the automatic quality fails. Underneath the received pronunciation, there is another voice. The voice that comes out of Stewie in that moment is broad Rhode Island. The flattened vowels and the specific intonations and the regional markers of the New England working class that Peter and Lois carry naturally and that Stewie has apparently been containing, actively and continuously, since before the show began. The therapist reacts with visible surprise. Stewie reacts with something that reads as alarm and embarrassment in roughly equal measure. The moment passes. The received pronunciation returns. The session continues. The show moves on. But the moment has happened, and it has happened in the 14th season of a show that has been using the received pronunciation accent as one of Stewie's defining character traits since the very beginning. And the information it deposits is significant. The accent is a choice. Stewie is performing an identity. The British accent is a construction that he began building at some point before the show's narrative timeline begins, and has maintained without interruption through 14 years of the show's depicted history, which, given the floating present convention, amounts to a continuous performance of indefinite duration in the show's internal logic. The question of why is not answered. The show is not a show that answers its most interesting questions, and this is one of its most interesting questions, so the why remains open. But the evidence within the show's material points towards several possible answers, each of which illuminates a different aspect of Stewie's character. The most straightforward reading is that the British accent is aspirational. Stewie is a baby born into a working-class household in Providence-adjacent Rhode Island, and the received pronunciation accent is the accent of the world he wants to be part of, rather than the world he was born into. The world domination plans, the sophisticated weapons, the elaborate schemes. These are all expressions of the same aspiration, the desire to be the kind of person who commands, rather than the kind of person who is commanded. The British accent is the linguistic version of the same ambition. It is Stewie performing the identity of the person he intends to become, and performing it so consistently and so early that the performance has become, for all practical purposes, the identity itself. Under this reading, the moment in the therapist's office is not a slip but a disclosure. The original version of Stewie speaking, briefly, before the performance reasserts itself. The Rhode Island accent that comes out is not a hidden true self in any simple sense, because the self that Stewie has been building through the performance is also real. The intelligence and the ambition and the elaborate inner life are not fakeries. They are genuine qualities that the performance was built to express and protect. But the accent underneath the performance is a reminder of where the performance began, which is in the body of a baby on Spooner Street in a town that does not appear on any map. The Rex Harrison connection has been noted by fan commentators who engage seriously with the character's design. Rex Harrison was an English actor best known for his performance as Henry Higgins in the 1964 film My Fair Lady, a film whose entire premise is organized around the idea that an accent can be learned, performed, and maintained to such a degree of perfection that it becomes indistinguishable from the natural speech of someone born into the class and culture that accent represents. Henry Higgins teaches Eliza Doolittle to speak differently, and in doing so, claims to make her a different person, or at least a person who can access the spaces that were previously closed to her because of how she sounded. The show has drawn on this connection in ways that are not always explicit, but that reward attention. Stewie is his own Henry Higgins, teaching himself, imposing on his own speech, the discipline that the fictional Professor Higgins imposed on Eliza Doolittle, with the same aspiration toward a class and culture that the original voice would not grant him access to. What is interesting about this reading is that it makes Stewie's accent not just a character quirk, but a piece of sustained and sophisticated self-improvement project. He is doing something that most people never do, which is deciding, at a point before the capacity for such decisions is normally available to a person, who he wants to be, and then building the linguistic infrastructure for that identity from the ground up. The fact that he is doing this before his first birthday, before he has language in the developmental sense that child psychologists use when they talk about language acquisition, is the part that the show simply declines to address, because addressing it would require the show to commit to an explanation for Stewie's intelligence that it has chosen to leave open. The accent mystery is the smallest and most intimate of the Stewie mysteries. It does not require time machines or mind control devices or world domination plots. It is just a voice and a decision and a moment in a therapist's office when the decision slipped and the voice underneath came through, and the person who has been performing the identity for all these years was briefly visible as the person performing it rather than the performance itself. The received pronunciation is back in place now. It has been back in place since the end of that episode. Stewie is in his room on Spooner Street, and if you press your ear to the door, what you hear is the British accent, precise and controlled, the accent of someone who has decided what they sound like and has never once relaxed their commitment to that decision. The Rhode Island is under there. It has always been under there. The show told you so, and then it moved on. And the mystery it left behind is quiet and specific and about something real. The distance between where you come from and who you decide to be. Section 11. The Multiverse, the Reset Button, and Why Nothing in the Show Matters. The Season 9 episode Road to the Multiverse is, from a certain angle, the most honest episode of Family Guy that has ever been produced. It is an episode that takes the show's foundational logic, the logic that governs how consequence works in the world of the Griffins, and makes it visible in a way that the show does not usually permit. Brian and Stewie travel between parallel universes. The device that allows them to do this is Stewie's, because of course it is, and it operates by targeting specific branching points in causal history where a different decision was made or a different event occurred, and exploring the universe that resulted from that difference. The universes they visit are recognizable versions of the show's world, rendered in alternate registers. The Disney universe where Stewie's ancestor converted to Christianity and the subsequent history of Western civilization followed different tracks. The universe where the Japanese won the Second World War and the cultural products of that world reflect that victory. The universe where everything is slightly better by a small but measurable degree, the universe where everything has degraded to a primitive visual state. The episode is funny in the specific way that Family Guy is funny when it is operating at a high level of creative energy and the writing is genuinely engaged with its own premise. The alternate universes are well realized. The observations about what different causal histories would produce are sharp and unexpected in the right ways. The episode moves with the kind of momentum that comes when everyone involved in making something is genuinely enjoying what they are making. But the episode also, without quite intending to, makes a point about the show's universe that is considerably more interesting than the surface comedy. If alternate universes are accessible, if the device that allows movement between them exists and works reliably, then the universe that Family Guy takes place in is not a unique or singular location. It is one branch among many branches, one possible world among an indefinite number of possible worlds, each one the result of a specific decision or event that resolved differently at a specific moment in causal history. The Griffin family of the show's primary universe is not the Griffin family. They are a Griffin family, the particular version of that family that resulted from the specific sequence of events that produced their world, surrounded at all times by an infinite number of other versions of themselves living the outcomes of different sequences. This has implications for the reset button logic that governs consequence in the show. The reset button is the informal term for the mechanism by which significant events in Family Guy's narrative are undone or set aside, by which characters who die come back to life, by which family relationships that were damaged or destroyed return to their baseline state at the start of the next episode, by which nothing that happens in an episode persists in a way that changes the fundamental texture of the world going forward. The reset button is not a unique feature of Family Guy. Every episodic television show without a serialized narrative structure uses something like it. But Family Guy has used it more explicitly, and has sometimes drawn attention to its own use of it, in ways that make the metaphor useful for examining what the show is actually doing when it undoes something it has done. Brian's death in Life of Brian, and his resurrection in Christmas, Guy 2 episodes later, is the most explicit deployment of the reset button in the show's history. The death was treated as real. The grief was real. The emotional response from the audience was real, substantial enough to generate press coverage and to trend on social media in ways that demonstrated that a significant portion of the audience had genuine emotional investment in Brian's continued existence. And then the reset, the time travel intervention that prevented the event, returned everything to where it was before the event happened. The reset was made possible by Stewie's time machine. This is the same Stewie whose mind control devices and ray guns and parallel universe navigation device all function in the show's internal logic. The technology exists, it works. It has been demonstrated to work. And the existence of working time travel technology in the show's universe means that any death, any tragedy, any consequence is potentially reversible by a character who has demonstrated access to the means of reversal. The finality that consequence depends on for its emotional weight is undercut by the availability of the mechanism that can undo it. The fan theory that Stewie is the show's curator of timeline, the figure who maintains the show's universe in its familiar state by intervening whenever events threaten to permanently alter it, is a logical extension of what the show has explicitly depicted. Stewie has the technology. Stewie has, in at least one documented case, used the technology to prevent a permanent alteration of the show's status quo. The theory proposes that this is not an exceptional event, but a regular practice, that Stewie's time travel and multiverse navigation capabilities are deployed consistently in episodes that the audience does not see to keep the world of Quahog recognizable from one episode to the next. Under this reading, the reset button is not a narrative convenience that the show deploys to avoid consequences. It is a deliberate action taken by a character with specific motivations. Stewie, who loves Brian, who has been shaped by his relationship to the household and the people in it, who is, in some complicated sense, invested in the continuation of the world as it is, uses his exceptional capabilities to maintain the exceptional stability that the show's universe requires. He is not just an evil genius baby who has softened into an emotionally available friend. He is the unseen force of narrative continuity, the character whose hidden labor makes the impossible stasis of Quahog possible. This theory is impossible to verify and probably not literally intended by the show's writers, which is exactly the kind of statement that applies to every worthwhile fan theory about every worthwhile fictional universe. Its value is not in its provability, but in what it illuminates about the show's structure when you take it seriously as a reading. The stasis of Quahog is maintained by something. The characters do not age, the consequences do not accumulate, the world does not move forward in the way that worlds in which events happen and time passes normally move forward. Something is preventing the normal operation of temporal cause and effect in this town. The show says it is narrative convention. The theory says it is Stewie. Both answers point to the same feature of the world, which is that Quahog is a place outside time, a place where the same night has been happening since January of 1999, with slight variations in the events that fill it, and where the mechanisms that should normally govern what happens after the night ends have been, by some means, suspended. The show is still running. The night is still happening. Stewie's light is still on under the door. Whatever is being maintained in that room, whatever is being monitored or calibrated or simply observed, it is being maintained tonight as it has been maintained on every night of the show's existence. The rest of the household does not know this is happening, or does not remember that it knows, which is the same thing in a world where the reset button clears the ledger every time it is pressed. Section 12. American Dad did it better and what that proves about the show next door. American Dad premiered on the 6th of February 2005. The premiere was placed by Fox immediately after the Super Bowl, which was the same strategy Fox had used to launch Family Guy in 1999, a strategy that guarantees an enormous initial audience in the way that only that specific slot can guarantee. American Dad was created by Seth MacFarlane along with Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman. It was produced by the same production company. It aired on the same network on the same night, in the same lineup. It was, by every surface measure, Family Guy's sibling. The dismissal was immediate and nearly universal. Critics noted the similarities, viewers noted the similarities. The common response was that American Dad was a lesser version of the show that already existed, a copy that lacked the specific energy and comedic identity of the original. The response was partly fair and partly lazy, in the way that immediate comparative responses are often partly fair and partly lazy. The show shared a creator and a production context, and a visual style and a primetime animation slot, and comparison was the natural response. But the comparison was made before the shows had had enough time to establish what they each actually were, and the conclusion that American Dad was the lesser version was a conclusion reached too quickly and with too little patience for what the show was still figuring out about itself. What American Dad was figuring out about itself, in those early seasons, was the same thing that all new shows spend their early seasons figuring out: the specific character and approach that distinguishes them from everything around them. The first season of American Dad leaned on political satire in ways that were one note enough to support the criticism that it had a single idea and was not quite sure what to do with it. Stan Smith, the CIA agent patriarch of the Smith family in Langley Falls, Virginia, was initially conceived as a vehicle for jokes about post-September 11 American conservatism, and those jokes, while sometimes sharp, did not constitute a television series on their own. But then, gradually, something happened that the critics who dismissed the show in its first season did not stay long enough to see. The show found out who its characters were. Not the versions of those characters that the first season had put forward, the sketch of who they might be, the outline that the writers were still filling in. The versions that existed underneath the sketch, the ones who emerged when the writers started making jokes that came from a place of genuine understanding of what these people were like and how they related to each other, and what was actually funny about them. Stan Smith became funny in a different way from the way he was funny in the first season. The political satire remained, but it became secondary to a more interesting and more sustainable comedy. Stan's relationship to his own convictions, to his family, to the gap between what he believes and how he actually behaves. He is a man of strong and specific beliefs who is regularly confronted with evidence that his beliefs are inadequate for the situations he finds himself in, and his response to that confrontation, which is usually some combination of stubbornness and unexpected capacity for growth, became the show's most reliable comic engine. The Smith family dynamic avoided the corrosion that damaged the Griffin family over time. Francine Smith did not become the detached and sometimes cruel presence that Lois Griffin became in the show's later seasons. Haley and Steve maintained consistent personalities and a genuine sibling relationship that the show could return to across many seasons without the relationship having fundamentally changed in character. The family still felt, a decade into the show's run, like a family that cared about each other, which is a feature of the early Griffin family that the later seasons of Family Guy allowed to erode. Roger the alien is worth examining separately, because Roger represents one of the most creative solutions to the problem of how to keep a single character interesting across many seasons that animated television has produced. Roger's ability to take on fully realized personas, complete with new names, new histories, new relationships, new speech patterns and behavioral tendencies, meant that every episode featuring Roger could, in practice, be featuring a different character. The alien underneath all the personas was consistent, alien, selfish in specific and entertaining ways, capable of affection that was always in tension with his capacity for cruelty, fundamentally not bound by human moral frameworks in ways that the show used, sometimes for comedy and sometimes for something darker. But the personas meant that the writers had an essentially unlimited supply of new material to draw from, because a new persona was a new character with new comedic possibilities, and the constraint was only the writer's imagination rather than the fixed parameters of a single established personality. Compare this to what happened with Stewie. Stewie's evil genius concept was retired because the writers felt they had exhausted it, and in its place they developed the more emotionally available version of the character, who became Brian's friend and adventure companion. What Roger's persona system demonstrated is that a single character concept does not have to be exhausted because you have explored all the obvious versions of it. You can find structural features of the concept that generate new versions of themselves. The evil genius baby could have built new machines, made new attempts, found new targets, developed new dimensions of the villain concept. The show chose not to pursue that, and Roger's persona system demonstrates what a show looks like when it chooses to pursue the generative possibilities of its own concepts rather than retiring them when they become familiar. American Dad also made a structural choice that had enormous implications for the quality of its storytelling over time. It decided not to use cutaway gags. This was a choice that distinguished it visually and narratively from Family Guy from the beginning, and its effects compounded over time. Without cutaways to fall back on, the writers of American Dad were required to make every episode function as a coherent story. Every joke had to emerge from the characters and the situations they were in. The plot had to carry the comedy rather than being a vehicle for delivering disconnected comedic interludes. This constraint made the writing harder and the results more satisfying. In the same way that a constraint in any creative medium tends to produce more interesting work than unlimited freedom, because unlimited freedom removes the pressure that forces creativity toward its better possibilities. The contrast between the two shows became, over time, one of the most discussed features of both of them in the fan communities that followed animated primetime comedy. It became a commonplace of those discussions that American Dad had surpassed Family Guy in quality sometime around the show's 4th or 5th season, that the show, which everyone had dismissed as a lesser copy, had become the standard against which the original was being measured unfavorably. This is an outcome that almost no one predicted in 2005, and its being the case is one of the stranger facts about the landscape of animated primetime comedy over the past 2 decades. The implication that this carries for the mysteries of Quahog is this: the strangeness of the Griffin household, the things that do not add up, the baby who should not exist as he does, and the dog who cannot logically be what he is, and the timeline that cannot be made coherent, and the father who should be in prison and never is. These are not the necessary features of a world that Seth MacFarlane created. They are the specific features of the version of that world that was mismanaged, that was allowed to drift without the oversight that would have maintained its internal coherence, that accumulated contradictions because no one was tracking the contradictions and resolving them before they became load-bearing elements of the show's mythology. American Dad, set in a household in Langley Falls, Virginia, with a CIA agent father and an alien in the attic, and a fish with a man's brain in a bowl on the counter, is a more coherent world than the Griffin household in Quahog, Rhode Island. It has fewer mysteries that it did not intend to generate. Its characters are more consistently themselves across episodes. The things it leaves unexplained are things it left unexplained on purpose, as features rather than gaps. The Griffin household's mysteries are mostly gaps. The baby who cannot be explained, the dog who cannot die, the timeline that cannot be made coherent. These are not the products of a show that decided what it wanted its mysteries to be and then constructed them carefully. They are the products of a show that ran for long enough and with enough inconsistency in the room where the decisions were made that the gaps accumulated and then became deep enough to be interesting. They are genuinely interesting. This is the unexpected thing. A show that did not plan its mysteries still managed to produce mysteries worth exploring because 25 years of telling stories about the same characters in the same town generates material whether the show intends to generate it or not, and some of that material, when you look at it closely, has the texture of something real. Quahog is dark tonight. The Smith house in Langley Falls is dark too, and quieter than the Griffin house because the people in it, the spy and his wife and their children and the alien and the fish, have been able to age in a way that the Griffins have not quite managed. They are, in whatever sense animated characters can be said to be okay. The Griffins are a different matter. They are on Spooner Street, and they are unchanged, and they are surrounded by the accumulated weight of 25 years of stories that they do not fully remember having lived. And the mysteries that those stories generated are sitting in the house with them, patient and unresolved, as they have always been. We have spent some time with those mysteries tonight. The baby with the weapons. The dog who came back from death. The chicken who will not stay down. The daughter whose father may not be the man in the living room. The father who should have been arrested years ago. The theory about the father's mind and what it is and is not showing us. The neighbor who is 61 years old and carries a speech inside him that is better than anything else the show has ever written. The timeline that cannot be reconciled. The voice under the British accent. The reset button that keeps the world from changing. The show next door that was dismissed as a copy and became the standard. None of these mysteries resolve tonight. They do not resolve because the show that contains them is not a show that resolves its mysteries. It is a show that keeps going, and in keeping going it keeps generating the material from which the mysteries are made, and the mysteries accumulate like the water off the Rhode Island coast accumulates in the bay, quietly and without intent, until you look at it and realize how much there is. The lights on Spooner Street are going off now. Peter is asleep on the couch, and the television is still on, casting its light across the room, and the light makes the familiar shapes of the living room look slightly different from how they look in the day, slightly more uncertain at the edges. Brian's martini glass is in the sink, not quite clean. Meg is in her room with the door closed. Chris is asleep in the particular sprawled way that Chris sleeps. Stewie's light is the last one, still on, still accompanied by the mechanical sounds that no one in the household is awake to hear. The mysteries are in there with him. They have always been in there with him. The night is long and quiet, and the questions are not going anywhere. If you have followed all the way to the end of this, thank you, genuinely. These companions take a long time to put together, and knowing that someone out there listened to the whole thing, maybe while falling asleep, maybe while the night was doing whatever the night was doing around you, makes the work feel worthwhile. If you enjoyed this, please like the video. It helps the channel in the simple and specific way that a number going up helps a channel. Subscribe if you have not, because there is more where this came from, more late nights in fictional towns, more mysteries that have been sitting in plain sight long enough that they have started to look like furniture. You can find the channel at Uncle Guy Lore. Leave a comment. Tell me which mystery got to you the most. Tell me if you have a theory about any of this that I did not cover. Tell me what time it was and where you were when you listened to this. Sleep well. The questions will be here in the morning. Expanded section. Returning to Stewie. Every weapon, every plan, every contradiction. Let us go back to the bedroom on Spooner Street, because there is more there than we covered the first time through. The bedroom deserves a longer visit. It is, by any reasonable standard, the most interesting room in a fictional Rhode Island town full of interesting rooms. The weapons inventory that Stewie Griffin has produced across the show's run is not a casual collection. It is a coherent body of engineering work with a consistent theoretical framework underneath it. The devices he builds are not random. They represent a progression of capabilities and a range of applications that, taken together, suggest not just exceptional technical intelligence, but a specific philosophy of power and control that runs through all of them. The mind control device that appeared in the show's early seasons is worth examining carefully. Mind control is a technology that real governments, including the United States government through programs like MKULTRA, that were declassified and publicly disclosed in the 1970s, have pursued with significant resource commitment and have never managed to produce in the form that science fiction and, apparently, Stewie Griffin have achieved. The MKULTRA program ran from the early 1950s through the late 1960s and involved experiments on human subjects that were conducted without the subject's knowledge or consent, using a combination of drugs, psychological techniques, and environmental manipulation to attempt to produce reliable control of human behavior. The program was shut down after its existence became public and was determined to have produced no reliable results at the scale that would have made it militarily or politically useful. Stewie's mind control device works. It produces reliable results. It is not a pharmaceutical approach or a psychological conditioning approach. It is a technological one. A device that produces a specific effect on neurological function through some mechanism that the show does not specify. The device is compact enough to be built and housed in a bedroom. It is operated by a 1-year-old. The fact that this level of neurological engineering is possible in the show's universe tells you something significant about the physics of that universe. Specifically, that the relationship between technology and consciousness is considerably more tractable in Quahog than it is in the world that the audience is watching from. The weather control device that Stewie built in the early seasons is equally significant. Climate and weather modification is another area where real governments and real research institutions have invested substantial resources and achieved limited results. Cloud seeding, the most successful real-world weather modification technique, produces modest and localized effects and requires significant infrastructure to deploy. Stewie's weather control device produces large-scale atmospheric effects from a bedroom in Rhode Island. The mechanism is, again, unspecified. The results are documented within the show's internal logic. The device works. What is interesting about the pattern of Stewie's inventions is not just that they work, but that they work in ways that the show's universe does not otherwise make available. No other character in Family Guy has access to technology of this kind. The government of the United States, as depicted in the show's various episodes that involve government agencies, does not appear to have mind control technology or weather control technology or time travel technology. These capabilities are specifically and uniquely Stewie's. The show has never explained how this came to be, which is the absence at the center of the character. The capabilities exist, they are documented, they are repeatedly deployed, and the origin of them. The question of where a 1-year-old in Rhode Island acquired the theoretical knowledge and the practical engineering skills to build devices that outstrip the technological achievements of the most advanced research programs in human history is simply left open. One theory that the fan community has developed is that Stewie's intelligence is not natural, in the sense that it did not arise from the ordinary developmental processes that produce human intelligence in typically developing infants. The theory proposes that Stewie was subject to some form of enhancement, either genetic or neurological or environmental, at some point before his birth or in the very early period of his life. The fact that the enhancement would have had to occur before any of the show's depicted events means that the agent of the enhancement would have to be someone who had access to Stewie and the means to perform the enhancement in that pre-narrative window. This is where the theory begins to intersect with Brian's mystery in interesting ways. Brian is, by the show's own logic, a dog who was found on the street and brought home by Peter. But a dog who walks on 2 legs, drives a car, attends social functions, and votes in elections is not a dog who emerged from the ordinary developmental processes that produce dogs. Brian is also enhanced, or at minimum is operating at a level of cognitive function that the biology of his species does not normally produce. The theory that connects Stewie and Brian through some common mechanism of enhancement that proposes some agency external to the Griffin household as the source of the capabilities that both characters display is speculative and unprovable within the show's material, but it has an internal logic that is more satisfying than the show's own implicit explanation, which is that these things are simply the case because the show decided they would be. The Season 9 episode The Big Bang Theory introduced another piece of Stewie's mythology that the show did not fully develop but that sits in the record waiting for examination. In this episode, Stewie travels back in time to the actual beginning of the universe, to the moment of the Big Bang itself, and his presence at that moment is presented as causally connected to the Big Bang's occurrence. This is a paradox, not a comfortably resolved one. If Stewie's presence at the moment of creation caused the creation of the universe, then Stewie's existence is preconditioned to the universe that produced Stewie's existence, which is the definition of a causal loop with no external origin point. The show presents this as a joke, which it is, but the joke requires a specific piece of information to land. Stewie must be the kind of entity whose causal influence can extend to the origin of the universe. Whatever he is that kind of entity. The therapist who saw Stewie in the 14th season would have had, if she had been paying attention in the right way, access to enough material to write a very significant series of case notes. She did not appear to be paying attention in the right way, because the show does not permit its supporting characters to understand Stewie in the way that a genuinely attentive supporting character would be forced to understand him if they engaged with the evidence in front of them seriously. But the case notes that she might have written, the clinical picture of a 1-year-old with advanced weapons manufacturing capability, suppressed regional dialect, documented causal influence on the origin of the universe, and a sustained performance of a constructed identity maintained without apparent effort across years of continuous social interaction, would be unlike anything in the literature. The yellow shirt is worn every day. The high chair is occupied at meals. The babbling, which is what most of the household hears when Stewie speaks, continues without interruption, providing a surface of normalcy that covers everything described above. The cover is perfect. It has been perfect since January of 1999. And under it, in a bedroom that is physically inconsistent with its own contents, the engineering continues. Expanded section. Returning to Brian the novel. The failure and what McFarlane is saying. Brian Griffin's novel is named Faster Than the Speed of Love. It was completed after years of procrastination and self-doubt and the specific avoidance behavior that characterizes the relationship between an intelligent person and a creative project they are afraid of. In the Season 7 episode The Man with Two Brians, the novel was terrible, not in the way that first drafts are terrible, with the understanding that the underlying material is worth preserving while the surface needs work, terrible in the deeper way, the way that a project is terrible when the conception is as flawed as the execution. The novel's publication was not a success. The critical reception was devastating. Brian's response to the devastating critical reception was the kind of response that reveals something about character. He did not revise, he did not reconsider, he defended the work with the specific intransigence of someone who cannot separate their evaluation of the work from their evaluation of themselves. This is a well-documented pattern in the psychology of creative people, and it is worth noting that the show depicts it with a specificity that goes beyond what would be required simply for the joke. Brian's relationship to his creative work, the procrastination and the avoidance, and the defensive grandiosity and the failure to distinguish between receiving criticism and receiving a verdict on his worth as a person, is drawn with enough precision that it reads as the product of some direct acquaintance with that experience. Seth MacFarlane has spoken publicly about his own creative ambitions in music and film, about projects that were received coolly, about the specific vulnerability of putting creative work into the world and having it evaluated. The precision with which Brian's creative psychology is drawn suggests that this is not pure observation from the outside. Brian's literary failure is not a one-time event in the show's narrative. It is a recurring condition. He has been trying to write something worth writing since the beginning of the show, and the record of his attempts is a record of near misses and self-sabotage, and the particular kind of self-deception that keeps someone engaged in a pursuit that they are not willing to be honest with themselves about, whether they are actually suited for. He is brilliant enough to know what good writing is. He is not quite brilliant enough, or not quite disciplined enough, or not quite willing enough to do the specific hard work that transforms the knowledge of what good writing is into the production of it. This is the most human thing about him, not the martinis or the two-legged walking or the electoral participation. The relationship to the novel is the thing that makes him feel like a real person rather than a cartoon approximation of one, because the relationship is too specific and too embarrassingly accurate to the interior experience of creative aspiration and creative failure to have been assembled without reference to something genuine. The bestseller episode from Season 9, Brian Writes a Bestseller, in which Stewie encourages Brian to write a self-help book and the book becomes a massive commercial success, is the most revealing episode in the Brian catalog, precisely because of what it shows about his response to success. The self-help book is not literature. Brian knows this. He wrote it quickly, without the labored seriousness that he brings to his attempts at genuine literary fiction, and the speed and casualness of the writing produced something that the public actually wanted. The commercial success of the bad book, set against the critical and commercial failure of the serious novel, is the kind of thing that happens to a specific type of person in a specific type of creative career, and Brian's response to that dynamic, the arrogance that came with the success, The contempt for the people who bought the book and the people who helped him write it is recognizably the response of someone who cannot accommodate the evidence that the things he takes seriously are not the things that the world rewards. He treated Stewie terribly in that episode. Stewie, who had believed in him when no one else had bothered to, who had provided the encouragement and the framework that made the book possible, was dismissed and condescended to at the moment of success. This is the pattern that Quagmire's speech in Jerome is, the New Black articulates so precisely. Brian claims to be a good person, while consistently behaving in ways that contradict the claim, and when confronted with the contradiction, he responds with more arrogance rather than with the self-examination that his self-image as an intelligent and morally serious person should generate. The question that the Brian material raises over the full course of the show's run is what the show thinks it is saying about this character. Is Brian a portrait of a specific kind of intellectual failure, drawn with enough precision to be damning? Is he an authorial avatar whose flaws are acknowledged as a kind of public self-examination? Is he simply a character who started as one thing and became another thing as the writers changed and the show's relationship to its own material shifted? All of these answers have some evidence behind them. None of them are entirely satisfying. The mystery of Brian Griffin is not the mystery of a dog who can drive a car. It is the mystery of what the show is doing when it shows us this person failing repeatedly in the same specific ways, and what, if anything, it wants us to feel about that. Expanded section. The chicken in more detail every fight, every location, every time he should have stayed down. Ernie the Giant Chicken's first appearance in Da Boom, the Season 2 episode that aired in December of 1999, was brief enough that it registered as an absurdist one-off gag rather than the beginning of what would become one of the show's most structurally consistent and most elaborately produced recurring elements. The episode was already operating in a heightened register. It was the Y2K episode, set in a post-apocalyptic version of Quahog, following the nuclear event that the show imagined as the real consequence of the Y2K bug, and its comedy was already committed to a specific kind of gleeful escalation. The chicken fight emerged from that environment of escalation and went further than almost anything else in the episode. The specifics of the original fight are worth noting because the subsequent fights all build from them. The coupon was for a meal or a service, the details of which the show did not specify with great precision. It was expired. Peter's reaction to the expired coupon was not a measured or proportionate response to a minor consumer inconvenience. It was a total and immediate escalation to physical confrontation, which is consistent with Peter's general approach to situations he finds frustrating, but was delivered in this case against a target whose physical dimensions and apparent willingness to engage made the resulting fight something considerably more spectacular than Peter's usual. Confrontations produce. The fight moved through the town. This is the structural feature that distinguishes the chicken fights from other violent confrontations in the show. They are not confined to a single location. The combatants move through buildings and across streets and through spaces that are occupied by people who did not ask to be involved in whatever this is. The civilian disruption is extensive. The property damage is continuous. The fight is not a fight in the sense that an argument is a fight, with an obvious geographical center and a defined space of engagement. It is a fight in the sense that a force of nature is a fight. It goes where it goes, and the things in its path are affected by it regardless of whether those things had any relationship to the grievance that started it. By the fourth and fifth time the chicken fight appeared in the show, it had achieved the status of a ritual in the audience's relationship to the show. The anticipation that built during the setup, the specific and recognizable sequence of events that preceded each fight, had become part of the experience. The audience knew what was coming, and the knowing did not diminish the watching. It intensified it in the way that anticipation of a known pleasure intensifies the pleasure without replacing it. This is the same mechanism that makes a familiar piece of music more satisfying rather than less satisfying with repeated listening. And the chicken fights, which were in a genuine sense pieces of animated music, with rhythm and dynamics and a compositional logic that repaid the kind of attention that music repays, benefited from the accumulated context that each new iteration brought with it. What has never been explained is the mechanism of Ernie's survival. The show has a complicated relationship to physical consequence generally, in the way that all animated comedies do. Characters sustain injuries that would be fatal to human beings and recover in the following scene or the following episode. This is standard and expected in the genre. and it would be unreasonable to hold the show to a standard that the genre does not apply to itself. But the chicken fights generate a specific kind of anticipatory consequence that goes beyond the standard cartoon logic. Because the fights are so extended and so genuinely violent within the show's own register that the resolution of each one, the moment when one combatant is clearly down and the other is clearly standing, reads as carrying more weight than typical cartoon violence carries. The expectation that each fight's ending is meaningful, that the apparent fatality is real within the show's logic, is built by the fights themselves through their own seriousness of execution, and then Ernie comes back and the expectation is shown to have been unearned. This is the mystery's circularity. The fights create the expectation of consequence, and Ernie's returns violate the expectation, but the violations do not change the expectation the next time, because the fights created again from the beginning. Ernie is part of a loop that neither the show nor the characters within it appear to be able to exit. He will survive the next fight because he has survived all the previous ones. Peter will engage the next time because Peter is the kind of person who cannot walk away from this specific provocation. The coupon is expired and it will always be expired, and the fight that the expired coupon generates will always happen and Ernie will always survive it. The strangest thing about Ernie, when you examine the full record, is that he is also apparently living a life between the fights. He has a wife, a fellow giant chicken whose appearance in at least one episode suggests that Ernie's domestic existence is not organized entirely around his conflict with Peter. There is an Ernie who goes home and has dinner and presumably talks about his day and occupies the spaces of a life that has nothing to do with the Griffin household. That Ernie is never shown. The show has no interest in him. He exists only as the antagonist of the fights, and the fights are the only context in which the show finds him interesting. His survival is managed by a narrative that needs him to be available for the next fight, and between the fights, he is simply somewhere, intact, waiting. The giant chicken stands on a corner in Quahog tonight, or maybe he is home with his wife, or maybe he is in whichever location the show will need him to be in when the next fight becomes necessary. The coupon grievance is intact. It was always going to be intact. That is the only thing about Ernie the Giant Chicken that the show has made absolutely certain. Expanded section. Meg Griffin, the Seahorse Seashell Party, and the message the show did not mean to send. The Seahorse Seashell Party aired on the 25th of September 2011 as the second episode of the 10th season. It was one of 3 interconnected episodes that aired that night as part of what Fox promoted as a special event, 3 episodes covering the same hurricane simultaneously, from the perspectives of 3 different Family Guy households. The episode focusing on the Griffin family during the hurricane is the one we are concerned with, and specifically with what happened in the 3rd act of that episode. Meg's breakdown in that episode was not sudden. It was the product of a specific confluence of circumstances. The confinement of the hurricane forcing the family into a shared space with no external escape valves, the accumulated weight of years of treatment that the episode did not invent, but that the show had been depositing into the record since season 4, and whatever version of a breaking point exists for a character who has been absorbing sustained emotional and physical mistreatment without meaningful outlet, for as long as Meg had at that point in the show's run. The speech that Meg delivers to her family in that episode is, in its way, the most precisely realized piece of character writing in the show's entire history. It is precise not because it invents new information about the Griffins, but because it organizes information that the show had already placed in the record into a coherent and devastating critique. She does not exaggerate. She does not invent. She catalogs, with the specificity of someone who has been observing and remembering with a thoroughness that her family has never suspected, because her family has never thought about what she might be observing and remembering. The response of the family to the speech is the other piece. When Meg's designated function as the household's primary absorber of dysfunction is suspended, even briefly, by her decision to stop absorbing and to instead distribute the analysis of what has been absorbed, the family cannot maintain its ordinary operational coherence. Peter and Lois begin to turn on each other. Chris and Brian engage in the kind of lateral conflict that becomes available when the vertical conflict, the conflict directed downward at Meg, is suddenly unavailable. The household falls apart in the specific and revealing way that a system falls apart when you remove the element that was managing the system's dysfunction by taking it into itself. This is what the episode reveals about the family structure. Meg is not just the target of the household's dysfunction. She is the manager of it. She absorbs the aggression and the anxiety and the displaced frustration that would otherwise circulate through the family system and damage the relationships that the family needs to function. She takes the damage so that the rest of the family does not have to damage each other as much. The emotional economy of the Griffin household depends on her willingness to be the one who pays the costs that the rest of the family generates but does not want to pay. And then the episode makes its most troubling decision. After the speech, after the revelation of the family's structural dependency on Meg's suffering, the episode concludes with Meg voluntarily returning to her role. She goes to Brian. She explains, in terms that the episode treats as a kind of sad wisdom, that she understands that the family needs her to be what she is, that her standing up for herself was a luxury that the family's well-being could not accommodate, and that she is choosing, with full awareness of what she is choosing, to go back to being the absorber so that the family can resume functioning. The writers appear to have intended this as a character moment of some dignity, a demonstration of Meg's intelligence and her capacity for self-sacrifice and her understanding of complex systems. The response from a significant portion of the audience was something different. The response was anger, and the anger was not at the quality of the writing but at the message the writing appeared to be delivering, that victims of sustained abuse should understand their structural function in the systems that abuse them and should choose, having understood it, to continue to be abused for the stability of those systems. Whether the writers intended to send that message is a question whose answer does not change the fact that the message was sent. The ending the episode chose communicates what it communicates, and what it communicates is not a neutral observation about the specific Meg of Family Guy in the specific dynamics of the Griffin household. It communicates something about how the show understood the situation it had created, which is that the situation was correct, was necessary, was Meg's to manage, and would be best maintained by her consent. The fan reaction to this episode is part of its record. It is consistently rated among the most hated episodes in the show's history, not because it was poorly made, not because the animation was bad or the voice acting was insufficient, but because of what it chose to say at the moment when it had an opportunity to say something different. The show had built over years of Meg's treatment toward a moment of genuine reckoning. The Seahorse Seashell Party arrived at that moment and chose not to reckon. Meg is 17. She is always 17. She is in her room tonight, and the room is quiet, and the hurricane has passed, and the speech she gave is in the record of the show the way everything she has ever done is in the record of the show, deposited, noted, and then set aside while the next episode begins, and the household returns to its ordinary configuration. The show eventually softened its treatment of her. Around the 14th and 15th seasons, the sustained cruelty began to ease. By the 22nd season, the extreme abuse had largely been retired. The show discovered, or admitted to discovering, that there were other things it could do with Meg, that she could be competent and resilient and occasionally the episode's hero rather than its punching bag. These episodes exist. They are evidence that the show knew, from the beginning, that Meg was a character and not just a function. The episodes where she is treated as a character rather than a function are uniformly better than the episodes where she is treated as a function. The show took longer than it should have to notice this, but it did eventually notice it. The mystery of Meg Griffin is not quite the same as the mysteries of Stewie and Brian, because the Meg mystery is not a mystery of unexplained capabilities or impossible biological facts. The Meg mystery is a mystery of intention. What did the show think it was doing with her over all those seasons? And when it stopped doing it, what did it understand that it had done? Expanded section. The timeline in more detail. What the arithmetic actually produces. The arithmetic problem with Family Guy's timeline is not subtle when you actually do the arithmetic. It is the kind of problem that becomes obvious the moment you commit to taking the show's established dates seriously, and it stays obvious thereafter, and the show has never found a way to resolve it, because resolving it would require the show to acknowledge a fact about its own structure that the floating present convention exists to prevent acknowledgement of. Here is the arithmetic, laid out plainly. Family Guy premiered in 1999. The first season depicted characters who were, by the show's own establishment, at specific points in their lives. Peter and Lois were adults in their mid-30s, Meg was 13 or 14, Chris was around 11 or 12, Stewie was 1. These ages were established through the show's depiction of the characters' stages of life rather than through explicit numerical statements in most cases, but they are consistent enough with the show's depiction that they represent a reasonable baseline. In Season 2, The episode Running Mates established that Peter and Quagmire went to high school together. If they went to high school together, they were in high school at the same time, which means they were approximately the same age at that time, which means that in 1999, they should be approximately the same age. In Season 8, Quagmire's Baby established that Quagmire is 61 years old. If the episode was set in approximately 2009, the year it aired, and Quagmire is 61 in 2009, then Quagmire was born in approximately 1948. If Peter went to high school with Quagmire, and high school is typically attended from around age 14 to 18, then Peter and Quagmire attended high school together somewhere between 1962 and 1966. In 1999, when the show premiered, a person born in 1948 would be 51 years old. Peter, who shared a high school with Quagmire, should therefore be approximately 51 when the show begins. The show depicts Peter as being in his mid-30s. The discrepancy is 16 years. The show has never resolved this discrepancy. The show cannot resolve this discrepancy without either changing Quagmire's established age or acknowledging that Peter's depicted age is inconsistent with the biographical information that the show has established. Neither of these is something the show is willing to do, because doing them would require engaging with the timeline in a way that the floating present convention specifically exists to avoid. The Bertram problem is another piece of the timeline's arithmetic failure. Bertram, the character who appeared in several episodes as the adversarial sperm from Peter's sperm bank donations, who became Stewie's primary nemesis, was established to have been conceived using Peter's donated sperm. This makes Bertram biologically Peter's son. Stewie, who is also biologically Peter's son, should therefore recognize Bertram as a biological sibling. The show used this occasionally for comedic purposes, but never pushed it to the implications that it should produce, because the implications include the fact that Stewie's ongoing conflict with Bertram is, at the biological level, a sibling rivalry of a very specific and strange kind. Bertram was eliminated from the timeline in the Season 8 episode Back to the Pilot, when Stewie traveled back in time and prevented an event that would have allowed Bertram to be born. This resolution created its own timeline problem. If Bertram was never born, then the episodes in which Bertram appeared did not happen, which means that the experiences Stewie and Brian had in those episodes also did not happen, which means that the versions of Stewie and Brian who traveled back in time to prevent Bertram's birth were carrying memories of events that, once the prevention succeeded, never occurred. The show does not engage with this paradox because engaging with it would require a level of narrative commitment to internal consistency that the show has never demonstrated and apparently does not intend to demonstrate. The Back to the Pilot episode is, paradoxically, both the show's most explicit engagement with its own timeline and the episode that most clearly demonstrates why the show should not engage with its own timeline. The episode is structured as a comedy about the strangeness of the show's relationship to its own past, with Brian and Stewie observing 1,999 versions of the characters and noting the differences, both visual and behavioral, between those versions and the current ones. The comedy works because the audience shares the knowledge that the show's 1,999 version and its current version are significantly different. And the episode's self-awareness about that difference is funny in the way that self-awareness is often funny. But the episode also actually uses a time machine, not as a metaphor, not as a structural conceit, as a literal device that Brian and Stewie travel in, and that takes them to 1,999, where they interact with the existing narrative of the show's first episode. The interaction creates causal ripples that the episode has to manage, and the way the episode manages them, by having Stewie and Brian return to the present and discover that their intervention has created an altered version of it, is an explicit demonstration that causal consistency is a real concern in the show's universe. Time travel has consequences. Changes to the past produce changes to the present. The show acknowledges this completely within the episode, and then the show goes back to not acknowledging it, because the mechanism of the time machine and the causal consistency it implies would create obligations for every other episode in which that mechanism is relevant, which is several. Brian's death and resurrection, for instance. The multiverse episodes. Any episode in which past events are visited or referenced or affected by current actions. The show has the technology for causal consistency and chooses not to apply it consistently because applying it consistently would require a level of narrative coordination that the show's production process does not support. This is ultimately what the timeline mystery resolves to. Not a mystery about the fictional world, but a mystery about the show's relationship to its own fictional world. The world was not built with a timeline in mind. It was built for the immediate purpose of each episode, with historical material provided when history was useful and set aside when it was not, and the accumulated history of 25 seasons of this approach is an arithmetic disaster that can be examined carefully and catalogued meticulously but cannot be resolved because the resolution would require the show to have made different choices from the very beginning, and those choices were not made. The clock on Spooner Street shows a time that is not quite consistent with any other clock in the show's history. It has been showing times that do not add up for over 25 years. The people on Spooner Street do not check the clock often enough to notice the discrepancy, which is the right choice for them, given that the discrepancy, once noticed, is the kind of thing you cannot stop noticing. Expanded section. The Lois Griffin question. The woman holding everything together and the things she knows. Lois Griffin is the gravitational center of the household in a way that the show has sometimes acknowledged and sometimes deliberately obscured. She is the person whose presence prevents the Griffin family from collapsing entirely into its own dysfunction. She is the one who negotiates between Peter's chaos and the children's needs, who maintains a functional domestic environment in conditions that would have produced institutional intervention in any household that law enforcement and social services were actually watching with sustained attention, who holds the emotional architecture of Spooner Street together through a combination of love and tolerance, and occasionally a kind of resigned pragmatism that the show has sometimes shown as wisdom and sometimes shown as complicity. The Lois of the early seasons is a recognizable character type, but executed with enough specificity to feel like a person rather than a type. She played piano with genuine skill. The show returned to this detail enough times that it registered as real rather than incidental. She had a complicated relationship with her wealthy family, specifically with her father Carter Pewterschmidt, who disapproved of Peter with a specificity that went beyond simple class prejudice, though class prejudice was certainly present, and who provided a recurring and consistent source of the specific kind of social humiliation that comes from a person's family never fully accepting the life the person has chosen. The Carter material was among the more consistently maintained character details in the show's early seasons because the dynamic between Carter and Peter was simple enough to be reproducible across many episodes without requiring much maintenance of a complicated internal logic. The question that the show gradually stopped asking about Lois is what she wants. In the early seasons, the show gave her desires and ambitions that existed independent of her role in the Griffin household. She wanted to play piano seriously. She wanted to connect with her children as individuals rather than as aspects of a household management problem. She had a life before Peter that the show referenced with enough consistency to suggest it was real rather than decorative, and the Stan Thompson history was one piece of that pre-Peter life that carried genuine narrative weight before the show allowed it to recede into the background. What happened to the Lois who wanted things is a question that parallels the question of what happened to the Meg who was just a normal teenager, because both characters were progressively redefined by their relationships to Peter's increasing extremity. As Peter became more chaotic and more dangerous and less accountable, Lois became the person who managed the fallout, and the management of fallout is a full-time occupation that leaves little room for the piano playing and the personal ambitions and the complicated relationship with her own identity that the early Lois carried. The show occasionally returned to Lois as a person rather than a function. The episode where she briefly became a model, and then a celebrity, and then had to navigate the specific disorientation of suddenly being seen differently than she had been seen throughout her adult life, was one of those returns. The episode where her history as a shoplifter was revealed, introducing a side of her that contradicted her primary household function, was another. These episodes were notable partly for their comedy and partly for the reminder they provided that Lois had been a person before she became the woman who managed the Griffin household. But the show did not sustain those returns. Each Lois episode that gave her individual specificity was followed by episodes in which she returned to the household management function and the specificity retreated. The cycle was the same as the cycle with Meg, a step towards something more interesting, followed by a reset to the familiar configuration. The Lois mystery is gentler than the other mysteries in this collection. It is not a mystery of unexplained capabilities, or impossible biology, or timeline arithmetic. It is the mystery of what happened to a character who was more interesting at the beginning than she was allowed to remain, and what the show thought it was doing when it progressively narrowed her down from a person to a function. The answer is probably that it was not thinking about it, that the narrowing was the result of what was available and convenient in any given episode, rather than a deliberate creative choice, which is its own kind of answer. Not a conspiracy against Lois Griffin, but a negligence toward her, which is harder to argue with and in some ways more concerning. She is in the kitchen on Spooner Street, or she is upstairs, or she is wherever the episode needs her to be. She knows things about this family that she has not told anyone, including us. The Stan Thompson history is one of them. Whatever she knows about Stewie's bedroom is another. Whatever she understands about the specific texture of Peter's relationship to Meg is a third. Lois Griffin is the person who has been present for all of it, who has observed everything that the show has depicted, and who carries the full record of the Griffin household in a way that no one else in the household does. She has not told us what she knows. She probably never will. That silence is also a kind of mystery. Expanded section. The American Dad connection, Klaus, Roger, and the CIA theory. The connection between Family Guy and American Dad runs deeper than shared creator and shared network and shared Sunday night lineup placement. It runs, if you take the fan theories about both shows seriously, into the specific and strange territory of a shared fictional universe in which the most extraordinary elements of the Griffin household might be connected to the institutional operations of an organization that the show literally placed in the neighborhood. The CIA in American Dad is not an abstraction. It is a physical location. The Langley Falls CIA facility where Stan Smith works is an actual place in the show's universe, with an actual institutional structure and actual programs and actual capabilities. Stan's work brings him into contact regularly with the operational side of intelligence work, which includes, in the show's depiction of that world, operations of considerable creativity and moral ambiguity. Things are done by the CIA in American Dad that would not survive public scrutiny, and the show uses this as both a comedic premise and occasionally as a source of something darker. Klaus Heisler, the goldfish with a German man's brain, is one of the most explicit pieces of evidence that the CIA in this fictional universe has advanced neurological modification capability. Klaus's situation, his human consciousness transferred into the body of a goldfish by CIA scientists as a Cold War operation, required technology that does not exist in the real world and has not been meaningfully approximated by any real research program. The CIA scientists who performed the transfer had to understand consciousness as something that could be moved between substrates, which implies a theoretical and practical understanding of the relationship between consciousness and physical matter that would represent the most significant scientific achievement in human history if it were real. This is the CIA of a television comedy, and the Klaus premise is a joke rather than a serious engagement with the philosophy of mind. But the joke requires the technology to be real within the show's universe, and the technology being real within the show's universe creates interesting implications for the question of what else might be possible for a fictional CIA that can move consciousness between substrates. Brian Griffin can move between substrates too, not his consciousness, but his entire mode of existence. He is a dog who functions as a human in every meaningful sense, who drives and votes and drinks martinis and dates women and processes language at a level that most humans do not achieve. The transition from dog biology to human cognitive function requires a similar kind of technological intervention to the Klaus transfer, or at minimum requires a framework of understanding about the relationship between intelligence and substrate that, within the logic of a shared fictional universe containing both shows, the CIA has demonstrably achieved. The theory that Brian Griffin is the product of CIA experimentation is unprovable within the material the show has deposited, but it is consistent with it. The CIA of American Dad can transfer consciousness. The CIA of a shared universe containing both shows could, plausibly, have produced a dog with human cognitive function through some related modification. The fact that Brian was found on the street by Peter, with no history attached, with no owner and no record, is consistent with an origin that was not intended to be traceable. Stewie's technology is the harder piece to accommodate within this framework, Because Stewie's capabilities exceed what the American Dad CIA appears to have achieved, even with its demonstrated ability to move consciousness between substrates. Time travel and parallel universe navigation are qualitatively different from neurological modification, but the framework of a shared universe in which an intelligence agency with extraordinary technical capabilities is operating in the background of ordinary domestic life is at least a container that can hold the mystery without resolving it, which is the most that any theory about Stewie can honestly claim to do. The two shows have occasionally interacted at a meta level. Family Guy characters have appeared in American Dad episodes and vice versa, usually in the background or in cameo roles that the shows have presented as jokes rather than as genuine canonical crossings. The Simpsons crossover episode, which aired in the 14th season of Family Guy and brought the Griffins and the Simpsons together in the same physical space, was presented as a canonical event within Family Guy's universe, which created a situation where the Griffin universe and the Springfield universe were confirmed to be the same universe, which has implications for both shows' relationships to their own internal logic that neither show has pursued. If the Simpsons universe and the Family Guy universe are the same universe, then the Springfield CIA, whatever institutional equivalent of American Dad's Langley Falls facility operates in or near Springfield, is also potentially relevant to the question of how extraordinary things in Family Guy's world are possible. This is the kind of theory construction that proceeds through a chain of conditional premises that each require the previous one, and it is the kind of theory construction that is most usefully understood as a way of thinking about what fictional universes imply rather than what they contain. The implications are interesting. The implications ask questions that the shows themselves did not ask and will probably not answer. That is the nature of implications. The CIA building in Langley Falls is lit tonight. Or some of it is. Intelligence agencies do not fully close. Klaus is in his bowl, his human consciousness in the goldfish body that the CIA put it in, watching whatever goldfish watch. Roger is in the attic in one of his personas, or in between personas, which is perhaps the most genuinely alien experience the show has depicted. The moment when the persona drops and there is just Roger, the original Roger, the alien underneath all the characters he has played, looking at a world that he has been observing and performing in for years without ever quite being of it. The mysteries do not stop at the Rhode Island border. Expanded section. What Quahog looks like at night. A final walk through the town. There is a specific quality to a coastal New England town at 3 in the morning in a season that is not quite summer yet. The salt in the air is heavier at this hour, or the absence of daytime noise makes it more present, one of those perceptual shifts that happen when the world quiets enough for things that were always there to become audible or smellable or otherwise sensible. The harbor, if you walk down to it, reflects the lights from the few buildings still running, and the water moves with the specific small restlessness of water that is never quite still, that has the Atlantic behind it and cannot stop moving entirely no matter how calm the surface appears. Quahog at 3 in the morning has been running for over 25 years. The specific version of 3 in the morning that it inhabits is not quite any particular 3 in the morning from the calendar that the audience is using. It is a 3 in the morning that is assembled from all the late nights that the show has depicted, from all the moments when the camera lingered on the exterior of a building, or moved down a street, or showed the water and the lights of the harbor. It is a composite 3 in the morning, built from 25 years of production decisions about what a fictional Rhode Island town looks like at night. The Drunken Clam is closed now, or at least its lights are off. The bar stools are empty. The long-running conversation that Peter and Quagmire and Joe have been having on and off for over 2 decades is suspended until the next episode requires it to resume. The conversation has covered a remarkable range of topics over the years, not because the show designed it that way, but because 25 years of writing requires a remarkable range of topics, and the Drunken Clam barstool is the show's most reliable setting for the kind of male friendship dialogue that the show uses when it wants to show the characters being people rather than plot functions. The high school named after James Woods is dark. Inside it, the lockers that Meg has opened and closed for 17 consecutive years of being 17 are closed. The hallways where she has been the subject of daily humiliation that the show has cataloged with varying degrees of seriousness are empty and quiet in the way that schools are always quiet at night, the specific quiet of a building designed for noise that is temporarily without it. Joe Swanson's house across from the Griffins is dark except for a window. Joe has always lived across the street, since the episode A Hero Sits Next Door in the first season, where he was introduced as the new neighbor whose arrival Peter initially resented and eventually came to value. Joe has been there since the beginning. His wheelchair is presumably in the house. The police cruiser, when it appears in the driveway, suggests the institutional affiliation that should have generated a response to Peter's documented conduct years ago and has not. The Griffin house at the end of Spooner Street has one light still on, Stewie's room. It has almost always been Stewie's room when the show needs a light to be on in the Griffin house at a late hour, because Stewie's light being on is consistent with the suggestion that whatever Stewie is doing, he is doing it at hours when the rest of the household is not awake to observe it. The consistency of this image, the specific location of the light in the specific window of the specific house at the end of the specific street in the town that does not exist on any map, is one of the more resonant visual facts that the show has produced across its run. The light means something. It has always meant something. What it means is not the show's responsibility to articulate, because the show is not in the business of articulating what its images mean. The show produces images and stories and characters and accumulates them across seasons without always understanding what it has produced, and the things it has produced that are most interesting are sometimes the ones it understood least about in the moment of producing them. The light in Stewie's window. The expired coupon grievance. The British accent over the Rhode Island voice. The novel that is almost finished and has been almost finished for years. The biology of a 1-year-old that does not correspond to the capabilities of a 1-year-old. The age of a neighbor that does not correspond to the life he is living. The daughter whose father may not be the man in the living room. The man in the living room who should be in an institution of some kind, and is instead on the couch. The world that resets at the beginning of every episode to something recognizable, maintained in that familiar state by mechanisms that the show has never fully acknowledged, and that one of its characters has both the technology and the motivation to operate. These things are out there tonight in a town that does not appear on any map, in a state of the specific suspension that the floating present creates, waiting for the next episode that will set them in motion again without resolving them, generating new material for the mystery catalog that has been accumulating since January of 1999 and shows no signs of closing any of its open questions. The Atlantic is cold tonight. It is always cold this close to New England, even in seasons that should be warmer. The town is quiet. The residents of Spooner Street are asleep, most of them. One of them is not. His light is on. Expanded section. Chris Griffin and the mystery of the child the show forgot to develop. Chris Griffin is 13 or 14 years old, depending on which episode you are using as your reference point. He is Peter's son, biologically and practically, in the sense that Peter's specific configuration of genetic material and Chris's specific configuration of genetic material are clearly related in the way that parent and child are related when the parent's physical characteristics are sufficiently dominant. Chris is heavyset. Chris is not intellectually distinguished. Chris has a sweet, generous quality that expresses itself in his relationships with other characters when the show is paying attention to him, which is less often than the show pays attention to his siblings, and considerably less often than the show pays attention to the adults in the household. Chris is the least mysterious Griffin, in the sense that the show has consistently left the least material in the record about him. The mysteries of Stewie and Brian and Meg and Peter are all mysteries generated by specific and contradictory information that the show has deposited over time and never reconciled. The mystery of Chris is a mystery of absence. He is the member of the Griffin family about whom the show has consistently had the least to say, and the question of why the show has had the least to say about him is, in its own way, as interesting as the more explicit mysteries generated by the other characters. What the show has established about Chris: he attends the same high school as Meg, James Woods High, though they appear to be in different years. He has artistic talent, established in the episode Peter Griffin. Husband, father, brother. In the 4th season, when it is revealed that Chris has a genuine and sophisticated ability to draw, the artistic talent is referenced and then periodically returned to across the show's run, making it one of the more stable biographical details attached to the character. He has a relationship with an evil monkey that lived in his closet for several seasons and appeared in multiple episodes as a visual gag that the show occasionally tried to develop into something more, but never quite managed to sustain at a level of narrative commitment that would have made the evil monkey a meaningful character element rather than a recurring background joke. He is kind, in the specific and somewhat unusual way that a character in a Family Guy household can be kind. Which is to say, he is kind in the interstices between the show's interest in other things, in the moments when the episode briefly directs its attention toward him, and he responds by being more generous and more emotionally available than the surrounding context would predict. His friendship with other characters, when the show depicts it, has a quality of genuine warmth that the adult relationships in the show increasingly lost as the seasons progressed. This may be because the writers were less invested in undermining Chris than they were in undermining Peter and Brian, or it may be because the character's youth provided a kind of protective innocence that the show was reluctant to corrode in the same way it corroded the adult characters. What the show has never established about Chris, what he wants, where he is going, what the 17 years of Chris Griffin's depicted existence, or the 35 of them if you count from the show's premiere to the present, has been moving toward or away from or around. The other Griffin characters have legible trajectories, even if those trajectories have been inconsistently maintained and frequently reversed. Peter wants to be left alone to eat and drink and watch television, and the episodes disrupt this by placing him in situations that his impulse control cannot navigate. Meg wants to be loved and accepted, and the show has spent years denying her both. Stewie wants, or wanted, the world, and has been gradually persuaded to want something smaller and more specific instead. Brian wants to be recognized as intelligent and talented, and is consistently confronted with evidence that his self-image and his actual capabilities do not fully align. Lois wants the household to function, and the household refuses. Chris wants things in individual episodes, specific things that the episode's plot requires him to want, and then the episode ends and the want is resolved or set aside, and the next episode begins without it. He is the most thoroughly episodic Griffin, the one for whom the reset button is most completely effective, the one who begins each episode most fully in a state that his previous episodes have not marked. This is not a complaint, exactly. It is an observation about the shape of the character as the show has constructed him, and the shape is interesting because its specific emptiness, the specific quality of the space that Chris occupies without fully inhabiting, is a feature of the show's architecture that everything else has to accommodate. He is the Griffin who is most completely at home in the floating present, because the floating present is exactly the temporal structure that his character requires. A perpetual present with no meaningful past and no implied future, just an ongoing now in which he is kind and a little confused and occasionally talented and always, fundamentally, unreachable by the narrative gravity that is actively pulling at everyone else in the household. The evil monkey left the closet at some point. The show resolved the evil monkey arc in the Season 8 episode Hannah Banana, which revealed that the monkey's behavior toward Chris had been the result of a misunderstanding, and that the monkey was not actually evil, but was experiencing his own problems that had caused him to direct aggression toward Chris, without Chris being the actual source of his grievance. This is, for an animated comedy, a surprisingly nuanced resolution of a recurring gag. The thing that frightened you was frightened itself, and its menace toward you was displaced from its actual pain. Chris, characteristically, responded to this revelation with understanding and generosity, rather than with continued hostility. The monkey moved out. The closet was empty. Another mystery of the Griffin household had resolved, or at least relocated. Chris Griffin is asleep tonight. His room is dark. Whatever he is going to want tomorrow has not yet arrived in his consciousness. He is, of all the Griffins, the one who rests most completely. Expanded section. The show's relationship to its own history, what the archive reveals. One of the most interesting features of Family Guy as an object of study, distinct from Family Guy as an entertainment product, is what its archive reveals about the relationship between intention and accumulation in a long-running television production. The show did not set out to create mysteries. It set out to create comedy. The mysteries are what happened when the comedy was produced for long enough, by enough different people in enough different creative moments, that the material began to accumulate in ways that the production did not plan for and cannot fully account for. This is different from what happens in a show that deliberately constructs its mythology. The mythology of a show like Lost, which was designed from the beginning to generate and then progressively resolve mysteries, is organized around the audience's engagement with specific questions that the show has defined and intends to answer. The mystery is the product. The viewer's experience of the mystery is the experience the show is designed to produce. Family Guy's mysteries are not the product. They are the byproduct. The show was designed to produce comedy, and the comedy was delivered, and the mysteries accumulated in the gaps between the comedic moments, in the places where the show placed information that it did not track carefully enough to maintain consistently, where it deposited character details that created implications it did not follow through on, where it told stories that could not quite be made coherent with the stories that had come before them. The archive of those gaps is the archive of the show's mysteries, and it is a remarkably rich archive for something that was built as a byproduct rather than a product. The richness of the archive is partly a function of the show's longevity. 25 seasons of material is an enormous quantity of source content for the kind of close reading that generates fan theories and mystery analysis. The Simpsons, which has been running even longer, has a similarly rich archive of inconsistencies and unexplained details and contradicted biographical information. Any long-running show produces this kind of archive, because the conditions of long-running television production, the multiple writers and the seasonal resets, and the floating present and the institutional momentum that keeps things going past the point where any individual artist's intentions are fully coherent, are conditions that generate gaps. What makes Family Guy's archive distinctive is the specific quality of its gaps. They are concentrated in the characters rather than distributed across the world-building, which makes them feel more personal and more emotionally engaging than the world-building gaps in, say, a fantasy or science fiction property would feel. The question of Stewie's origin is intimate in a way that a question about a fictional kingdom's political history is not, because Stewie is a person, or a character who functions as a person, and the question of his origin is the kind of question that we ask about people we know, or that we wish we could ask about ourselves. The question of who Meg's father is carries the same intimacy. The question of what Brian is really doing when he is alone with his novel manuscript, and the martini, and the specific loneliness that the early seasons depicted so precisely. The question of what Lois knows, and has always known, and has chosen, for reasons that the show has never articulated, not to say. These are questions about people in a household, and the household is the most familiar unit of human organization, and the mysteries inside a household have a different texture from the mysteries of a world or a universe. This is why the mysteries of Quahog persist in the audience's imagination across years and decades of the show's run. It is not because they are structurally complex or because they have been deliberately planted by a creative intelligence who knew what they were doing. It is because they are about people, or about the simulation of people, and people are interesting in ways that worlds are not. And the questions that the show leaves open about these specific people, in this specific household, on this specific street, have the same texture as the questions we carry about the people in our own households, our own histories, our own unexplained rooms. The show keeps running, the archive keeps growing, the questions sit in it, patient and unresolved, in the company of the 25 years of material that surrounds them. The archive is always open. The archive is the town itself, stretched out across seasons, available to anyone who wants to walk through it at this hour when the streets are quiet and the lights are low and the people who live here are, most of them, finally asleep. Most of them. One of them has a light on. He has always had a light on. Expanded section. The sound of the show, what the music reveals about the world. Family Guy has a score. Not just incidental music, but a recurring body of musical material that has been used across the show's run to shape the emotional texture of scenes in ways that the dialogue and the animation alone would not produce. Ron Jones composed the music for the original 3 seasons and produced a body of orchestral work that was, by the standards of animated primetime comedy, unusually rich and dramatically aware. The music in those early seasons treated the show as something worth scoring seriously, with full orchestral arrangements that could move between comedy and something closer to genuine emotional underscoring, with a flexibility that matched the show's own tonal range in those years. The decision to end Jones's involvement with the show after the 3rd season was widely covered in entertainment journalism at the time and was attributed to a cost-cutting initiative by Fox that reduced the budget for original music and required the show to use a library music system. Instead, the transition was audible. The specific texture of the orchestral work that Jones had created for the show's emotional moments, the particular quality of the strings and sequences where the show was reaching for something warmer or more serious than its baseline comedy register, was not reproducible through library music in the same way, and the later seasons had a different sonic texture as a result. This matters for the mystery discussion because the music is one of the ways that the show communicates about its own emotional register, about how seriously it wants you to take the things it is depicting. When the early seasons used full orchestral scoring for a scene between Peter and Lois, the music was telling you that this moment had weight, that the relationship it was depicting was one the show took seriously, that the emotional content was real and not just backdrop for the next joke. When that scoring was replaced, the signal changed, and the emotional weight that the music had been communicating became harder to locate. The theme song, composed by McFarlane with various collaborators and featuring the opening sequence of the Griffin family singing around the piano, is a piece of self-referential comedy that also functions as a piece of genuine musical information. The arrangement is Broadway-inflected, intentionally so, and the Broadway reference communicates something about the world of the show. This is a world with a heightened relationship to musical performance, where breaking into song is less strange than it would be in a more naturalistically rendered version of Rhode Island. The show has used musical sequences throughout its run, and the most effective of them, the ones that landed as something more than parody or novelty, were effective partly because the show had established from its opening seconds that music was native to its world. The Peter and Brian friendship, which was the show's most emotionally reliable relationship in the early seasons, was supported by musical choices that are audible in those early episodes if you go back and watch them now. The scenes where the two of them were simply in the same space, talking or sitting in the comfortable silence of a long-established friendship, were scored in ways that communicated the warmth of the relationship without insisting on it, that let the music do the emotional work of the scene rather than the dialogue having to carry all of it. When the music changed, something of that warmth changed with it. The relationship continued to be depicted, and the voice performances continued to carry genuine chemistry, and the dialogue continued to be capable of real emotional effect. But the sonic environment was different, and the difference was perceptible, and it was one more small element in the accumulation of small elements that made the early seasons feel different from the later ones, in ways that were hard to articulate individually but collectively unmistakable. The sound of Quahog at 3 in the morning would be the sound of the harbor, and the distant traffic on whatever state road passes close to town, and the specific quality of the wind off the Atlantic when the houses are quiet enough to let it be audible. There would not be music. Music is for the waking hours, for the moments when the show is running and the world is lit and the characters are in motion. At 3 in the morning, there is just the wind and the water and the light in the bedroom window at the end of Spooner Street, and whatever sound that light's continued presence implies. The faint mechanical precision of something being made by someone who should not be able to make it. That sound is not in the score. It is not orchestrated. It is just the sound of a mystery operating in a quiet house in a town that does not appear on any map, doing whatever it does in the hours that the show does not depict, maintaining whatever it maintains. The score would come back in the morning. It always does when the show resumes. Expanded section. The Bertram arc and what it tells us about how the show handles consequence. Bertram was one of the more ambitious recurring character experiments that Family Guy ran during its middle seasons, and the arc of the Bertram storyline from its introduction through its conclusion and back to the pilot tells you something important about the show's relationship to its own mythology that is worth examining directly. Bertram was introduced as a character in the Season 4 episode Mission Impossible, in which Peter and Lois discover that Lois is pregnant again, and Stewie, alarmed by the prospect of a sibling who might displace him, enters Peter's bloodstream and attempts to eliminate the potential competition. The episode is a tour of Peter's internal biology, rendered in a visual style that mixes scientific illustration with the show's typical animation, and it is one of the more genuinely creative episodes from the revival seasons in its willingness to commit to a premise that most shows would treat as a one-off visual gag and instead build a full episode around. Inside Peter's bloodstream, Stewie encounters Bertram, a sperm cell who can speak and who is, within the logic of the episode, a fully realized character with opinions and plans, and the specific kind of antagonistic intelligence that the show uses for its most interesting recurring villains. Bertram was voiced by Wallace Shawn, whose voice carries a particular quality of dangerous pleasantry that the character required. The episode established Bertram as Stewie's nemesis, a figure of comparable intelligence and comparable ambition, whose interests were systematically opposed to Stewie's, and the show returned to this dynamic across several subsequent episodes. The Bertram material represented one of the show's more sustained attempts to give Stewie a genuine antagonist, which the show needed because Stewie's primary stated antagonist, Lois, had progressively shifted from being a real threat to Stewie's plans to being a background presence in his storylines as the show softened the evil genius material. An antagonist who matched Stewie's intelligence and who could operate at the level of the plans and devices that defined Stewie's existence was a genuine creative opportunity, and the show used it intermittently without fully committing to what it had. The resolution of the Bertram storyline in Back to the Pilot required Stewie to travel back in time to prevent the event that would have allowed Bertram to be born, which meant eliminating Bertram from the timeline entirely. This was a consequence that the show treated as significant within the episode, but that the show's normal relationship to consequence then immediately applied. Bertram was gone, the threat was resolved, and the show moved forward without the Bertram material having permanently altered the landscape of Stewie's world in any way that subsequent episodes had to accommodate. The specific irony of the Bertram resolution is that the resolution required the show to acknowledge its own time travel technology as real and consequential within the universe, and then to use that acknowledgement to eliminate a character, rather than to open up the narrative possibilities that a working time travel device implies. Every long-running story that introduces time travel faces the narrative problem of why the characters with access to it do not use it to fix everything, and the typical solution is to establish rules that limit the technology's applicability. Family Guy's solution was to use the technology to resolve a specific storyline and then not follow through on the rules that the use implied. If Bertram can be erased by traveling back in time to prevent his birth, then anyone in the show's universe can be erased by the same method, applied to an earlier moment in their causal history. Brian's death and resurrection demonstrated that the technology could also be used to prevent deaths. The logical endpoint of a fictional universe in which time travel is available and functional and has been demonstrated to work is a universe in which nothing is permanent, in which every consequence is reversible by the application of sufficient technological capability, in which the accumulated weight of events has no actual weight because any event can be undone at the cost of a return trip. This is, in a certain sense, the accurate description of the show's universe. Nothing is permanent. Consequences do not accumulate in the way that consequences accumulate in a world with real temporal structure. The weight of events is zero in the long run because the long run does not exist in a world that resets at the beginning of each episode. The time travel technology is not an exception to this. It is the mechanism that makes it explicit. Stewie, who has the technology and has demonstrated the willingness to use it to preserve the things he values, is the walking acknowledgement that the show's universe does not work the way universes are supposed to work. Bertram is gone. He was erased before he could exist, which means he never existed, which means the episodes in which he appeared are set in a timeline that the show's own actions have eliminated. He is the cleanest example of the show's relationship to its own past. It can undo things, and sometimes it does, and the undoing removes the thing, but cannot remove the viewer's memory of having watched the thing before it was undone. The viewer's memory is the only permanent record in Quahog. Everything else is subject to revision.